Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been a logger for over 15 years now, working all over the Pacific Northwest. I've spent more time in forests than most people spend in shopping malls. I know woods, I know tracks, I know animals. What I found last Sunday, though, I still can't explain it, and it's been keeping me up at night ever since. I usually take Sundays off to do my own exploring. There's this section of forest about 40 minutes from my cabin that I'd been meaning to check out. Just some unmarked woodland that looked interesting on the topo maps. Nothing special, just somewhere new to wander through. I packed light that morning. Just water, a couple protein bars, my hunting knife, and a small first aid kit. Basic stuff. The weather was perfect that day. Not too hot, maybe high 60s with a light breeze. The kind of day where you feel bad for anyone stuck inside. I parked my truck at this little clearing where some logging roads intersect and headed east into the trees. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. I spotted the usual deer trails, some rabbit droppings, heard a couple woodpeckers going at it. Normal forest stuff. I was making mental notes of good fishing spots near the creek when I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It looked like a game trail at first, but something was off about it. Way off. The path was wider than a typical deer trail, and the undergrowth was pressed down in a way I hadn't seen before. But what really caught my attention were the prints. I've tracked black bears, grizzlies, moose, you name it. These prints were massive, bigger than any bear print I'd ever seen. But here's the weird part. No claw marks. Bear tracks always show claw impressions extending from the toes. These didn't have any. They almost looked like, well, like giant human footprints, but that's crazy, right? I knelt down to get a better look. The impression was deep. Whatever made it was heavy, really heavy. I placed my own boot next to one for comparison. I wear a size 13, and this print was at least twice as long and much wider. The detail was incredible. I could make out what looked like toe impressions at the front, a deep heel at the back. What really got me, though, was the spacing. I'm 6'2", and I've got a decent stride. These prints were spaced about 5 feet apart. Consistently, I tried to match the stride by stretching as far as I possibly could, and I couldn't do it without jumping. Whatever made these tracks was taking casual steps that I couldn't physically match. Even more bizarre, the trail went up some pretty steep inclines, and the stride length didn't change. It's like whatever made these tracks wasn't even bothered by the terrain. It just maintained this impossible stride, regardless of whether it was walking on flat ground or climbing a 30-degree slope. At this point, I was feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. I decided to follow the trail, keeping my eyes open for any signs of what might have made the tracks. That's when I noticed something else strange. The twigs. The path was littered with freshly stripped twigs, the kind you'd see if something had been chewing the bark off small branches. I looked up, and what I saw made the hair on my neck stand up. The trees on both sides of the path, for about 20 feet in each direction, had their upper branches completely stripped bare. I'm not talking about little saplings either. Many of these trees had trunks 4 inches thick near the ground, sturdy trees that should have been difficult to bend. But something had been bending them down to get at the tender tips and leaves at the top. The evidence was clear as day. The upper branches were broken and hanging, stripped clean of their leaves and buds. Some of the trees still hadn't sprung back to their original position. Like they'd been bent so far, they were partially damaged. I reached up and grabbed one of the affected trees, a healthy birch about 12 feet tall, with a trunk maybe 4 inches in diameter. I'm a strong guy. I lift logs for a living. But when I tried to pull that tree down the way it had clearly been pulled before, I could barely move it. I had to use my full body weight and really strain to get it to bend even a little bit. Whatever did this had been casually pulling down these trees like they were blades of grass, stripping off the most nutritious parts, and then moving on. I noticed piles of something that looked like chewed-up bark under some of the trees. It was like whatever was eating had been taking the nutrients from the bark and spitting out the fibrous remains, similar to how you might eat a cherry and spit out the pit. The piles were fresh. The plant material hadn't even started to brown yet. As I continued following the trail, I found more evidence of feeding. There were Saskatoon berry bushes that had been picked clean, but only the upper parts that would be out of reach for a normal person. The berries at normal human height were untouched, like whatever was feeding couldn't be bothered to bend down for the easy pickings. About a half-mile along the trail, I found a small clearing where the creature had apparently stopped to rest. The ground was pressed down in a large oval shape, like something massive had sat there. Around this spot, there were more discarded twigs and bark piles, plus some half-eaten shoots from plants I recognized as being high in nutrients, but bitter to the taste. Whatever was eating this stuff had a different palate than humans, that's for sure. By this point, I'd been following the trail for maybe an hour, and the rational part of my brain was trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was some weird combination of animals using the same path, but that wouldn't explain the consistent footprints, a bear standing on its hind legs occasionally. But the stride was too consistent for that, and again, no claw marks. I was so focused on the ground and the signs of feeding that I almost missed the most unsettling part. I had stopped to take a drink of water when I felt, I don't know how to describe it exactly. It was like that feeling when you know someone's watching you, but amplified. I slowly looked up from my water bottle, and that's when I saw the tree. It was a large pine about 50 yards ahead of me, perfectly normal, except for one thing. There was a clear handprint pressed into the trunk about 8 feet off the ground. Not a paw print, a handprint, with 5 distinct finger impressions. The bark was pushed in like modeling clay, like something with incredible strength had just casually placed its hand against the tree. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The handprint was enormous. My entire hand fit inside just the palm portion of the impression, and it was fresh. The sap was still sticky where the bark had been compressed. I took a step back, suddenly very aware of how quiet the forest had become. No birds, no squirrels chattering, nothing. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and my own breathing, which seemed too loud in the silence. That's when I smelled it. A powerful, musky odor like wet dog mixed with something rotten. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. It just seemed to suddenly envelop the area. I've been around plenty of wild animals, and nothing smells quite like that. It was overpowering, making my eyes water and my stomach turn. I decided I'd seen enough. Whatever had made those tracks, whatever had been bending those trees and leaving those handprints, it was something I didn't want to meet face to face. I turned to head back the way I came. That's when I heard it. A deep, rumbling sound from somewhere to my right. Not quite a growl, not quite a breath, something in between. It was brief, just a second or two, but it froze me in place. Then came the crack of breaking wood. Something big was moving through the trees about 100 yards away, snapping branches as it went. I couldn't see anything through the dense foliage, but I could track the movement by the sound and the way the tops of the smaller trees swayed as something pushed past them. Whatever it was paralleling my position, moving in the same direction I had been walking. It wasn't charging or making any aggressive moves, just calmly making its way through the forest. But the casual strength it displayed as it pushed through the underbrush was terrifying. I heard whole saplings splintering like toothpicks. I slowly, quietly started backing away, trying not to make any sudden movements. I'd left my gun in the truck like an idiot, thinking I was just going for a casual Sunday hike. All I had was my hunting knife, which suddenly felt very inadequate. The movement in the trees stopped. The forest went completely silent again. I held my breath, straining to hear any indication of where the creature had gone. For almost a minute, nothing happened. Then, about 70 yards ahead of me, something huge stepped out onto the game trail. I only saw it for a split second before I dove behind a large fallen tree. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. It was covered in dark hair or fur, with long arms that hung down past its knees. Its back was to me, so I didn't see its face, but the sheer bulk of it was overwhelming. Shoulders wider than any human I've ever seen, a neck thick with muscle. It paused on the trail, its head moving slowly as it seemed to scan the area. Then it reached up, casually reached up to a height I couldn't have reached jumping, and pulled down a branch from a nearby tree. The strength it displayed was casual, effortless. It stripped the leaves from the branch in one quick motion, stuffed them in its mouth, then discarded the bare twig onto the ground. I was too terrified to move, barely breathing as I watched from my hiding spot. The creature stood motionless for a moment, then tilted its head back slightly. I realized it was smelling the air, smelling for me. I don't know if it caught my scent or heard me or what, but suddenly it turned its head in my direction. I couldn't see its face clearly through the foliage, but I had the distinct impression it was looking right at me, right through me. That's when I made a mistake. In my panic, I shifted position slightly, and my boot scraped against a rock. The sound seemed deafening in the silence of the forest. The creature's reaction was immediate. It dropped the branches it was holding and turned fully in my direction. For just a moment, I saw its face, or what I could make out of it from that distance. Dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow, a wide nose, a mouth that seemed too large for a human face, but not quite animal either. It took one step toward me, one massive step that covered about 6 feet of ground, and that was all I needed to see. I bolted. I abandoned all thoughts of being quiet or careful and just ran for my life back the way I had come. I heard it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, but I didn't look back. I just ran, harder than I've ever run in my life, leaping over fallen logs and crashing through bushes. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming in protest, but pure terror kept me moving. I don't know if it was actually chasing me or just startled by my sudden movement, but I wasn't about to stop and find out. I ran all the way back to my truck, fumbled with the keys with shaking hands, and got the hell out of there. I haven't told anyone about this until now. Who would believe me, Eve? I've spent the last few days trying to rationalize what I saw, trying to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe I was dehydrated and seeing things. But I know what I saw. I know what made those tracks, what bent those trees, what left that handprint. I'm never going back to that part of the woods again. Whatever lives there can have it. I just needed to get this off my chest because it's eating me alive, keeping it to myself. I don't have proof. I was too scared to take pictures. All I have is what I saw with my own eyes and the certainty that there's something in those woods that shouldn't exist. Story 2. I've never told this story to many people because I know how it sounds. My parents and I have talked about it among ourselves over the years, but we've mostly kept it to ourselves. It's been over 20 years now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that day in the mountains. This happened in September 2002, when I was a sophomore at Sonoma State. My parents had driven down from Washington to visit me at college, and we decided to make a mini vacation out of it. Dad had always wanted to see the giant redwoods, so after spending the weekend on campus, we headed north up the California coast in their Toyota 4Runner. We spent a night in Oric, this tiny town where they have the world's tallest tree. Mom kept joking that everything in the town was world's tallest themed, tallest ice cream, tallest burgers. The next day we continued north, passing through these little towns I'd never heard of before. Witchpeck, Orleans, Sumsbar. The roads got increasingly narrow and winding as we made our way inland towards Siskiyou County. My dad had this old road atlas he refused to replace with GPS, and he'd circled some hiking areas he wanted to check out. We spent the night at this little motel in Cecilville, honestly just a few buildings in the middle of nowhere, and planned to hike the next day. The lady at the front desk told us about a nice trail between Packers Peak and Mount Hilton where we could see some incredible views. We set out early the next morning. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected because the Forest Service roads were rough. Dad kept saying, "Just a little further," while Mom shot him these looks from the passenger seat. When we finally parked and started hiking, it was around 9:30 a.m. Perfect weather. Sunny but cool. Typical September in Northern California. The trail was beautiful but not well maintained. We had to navigate around fallen trees a few times, and there were spots where the path almost disappeared. After about 3 hours of hiking, we came to this amazing creek, probably part of the South Fork of the Salmon River, according to our map. The water was crystal clear and ice cold. We found a nice flat area with some big rocks where we could sit and have lunch. While we ate our sandwiches, Dad kept pointing out different birds and plants. He's always been into that kind of stuff. Mom was taking pictures with her new digital camera. I remember feeling really peaceful, just being out in nature with my parents, away from campus stress and classes. After lunch, I wanted to stretch my legs, so I suggested we explore a meadow area we could see about a quarter mile from our lunch spot. We left our backpacks by the creek. I remember specifically placing mine against this distinctive reddish rock, so we'd find our way back easily. We took only the camera and water bottles with us. The meadow was dotted with these beautiful wildflowers, even that late in the season. Mum was having a blast, taking close-up photos of everything. We probably spent about 45 minutes wandering around before heading back to our backpacks. That's when everything changed. As we approached our lunch spot, I noticed something odd about the creek bank near our backpacks. At first, I thought maybe someone else had come along the trail while we were gone, but we hadn't seen anyone else all day. When I got closer, I froze. There were footprints in the wet soil by the creek, huge footprints that definitely weren't there during lunch. My dad saw me stop suddenly and asked what was wrong. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "look at these tracks." My parents came over and we all just stood there staring. The footprints were enormous, unmistakably foot-shaped, but way bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. They had 5 toes, just like human feet, but the proportions were different. The toes seemed longer and the arch of the foot was more pronounced. Dad immediately went into analytical mode. He took off his binocular strap and used it as a measuring tool. The prints were approximately 15 inches long and 6 inches wide. We counted 12 distinct impressions in the soft mud by the creek. What was most unsettling was the pattern of the tracks. Whatever made them had come from across the creek, walked right up to where our backpacks were sitting, and then returned the same way. There were no tracks leading away from the area in any other direction. My mum's face had gone completely white. "Check if anything's missing," she whispered. We quickly inspected our backpacks. Nothing was taken, but my backpack had been moved slightly from where I'd left it. It was no longer leaning against the reddish rock, but was sitting upright about 2 feet away. The top flap was unzipped, though I was almost certain I'd closed it. Dad walked to the edge of the creek and pointed to the opposite bank. "Look there," he said. I saw what he was pointing at, several stones that were wet on top, as if something had recently stepped on them while crossing the creek. The stream wasn't very wide at this point, maybe 15 feet across and relatively shallow. "Let's take some pictures," I suggested, grabbing Mum's camera. I took several photos of the footprints from different angles, making sure to include my own boot next to one for size comparison. My hiking boot looked like a child's shoe next to the massive impression. I also took close-ups of the individual toe marks and the depth of the prints in the soil. While I was taking pictures, Dad was scanning the tree line on the other side of the creek with his binoculars. "I don't see anything moving over there," he said, but his voice had this edge to it I'd rarely heard before. Mom was getting increasingly nervous. "Do you think it's still watching us?" she asked, looking around anxiously. I remember feeling a strange sensation on the back of my neck, like we were being observed. I've always been skeptical about that feeling of being watched thing, but in that moment I became a believer. It wasn't just paranoia, there was a palpable heaviness in the air. The weird thing was the silence. I've since done a lot of research on Sasquatch encounters, and many people report hearing strange vocalizations or smelling a strong, musky odor. We experienced neither. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, actually. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent. Dad suggested we should check if there were any other tracks in the area. We carefully searched a radius of about 50 feet around our lunch spot, but found nothing except our own boot prints. The only tracks from the unknown visitor were those leading to and from the creek. "Whatever this was," Dad said, keeping his voice low, "it came specifically to check out our stuff, and then left." I felt a chill run through me despite the afternoon warmth. I looked at the footprints again, trying to process what I was seeing. The impressions were deep. Whoever or whatever made them was heavy. The stride length between prints was much longer than what would be normal for even a very tall human. Mom had been quiet for a while, but she suddenly spoke up. "We need to go. Now." There was no argument from Dad or me. We quickly packed up our things, triple-checking that we had everything. As we prepared to leave, I heard a faint sound from across the creek, just the slightest cracking of a branch. All three of us froze and looked at each other. Dad raised his finger to his lips and we listened intently. There was nothing more, but it was enough to speed up our packing. We didn't speak much as we hiked back to the car. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made us jump. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something massive emerge from the trees. The hike back seemed to take twice as long as the hike in, though I'm sure that was just our anxiety stretching time. When we finally reached the car, we practically threw our backpacks in and jumped inside. Dad locked the doors immediately, something I'd never seen him do before in a remote area. As we drove away, I watched the trailhead disappear in the side mirror, still feeling that inexplicable sensation of being observed. That night, at our hotel in Eureka, we reviewed the photos on Mom's camera. The footprints looked even more imposing on the small digital screen. We debated what to do with the information. Should we report it to someone? Who would we even tell? Would anyone believe us? In the end, we decided to keep it mostly to ourselves. Dad did contact a forest ranger the next day, who listened politely, but didn't seem particularly interested. He mentioned that there had been similar reports in the area over the years, but his tone suggested he was just humoring us. After returning home, I dove into research about Sasquatch sightings in Northern California. I learned that Siskiyou County has had numerous reported encounters over the decades. The area between Packers Peak and Mount Hilton, where we had been hiking, was apparently a hot spot for sightings. What struck me most was how similar many of the reports were to our experience. The size of the footprints, the behavior of approaching campsites or gear when people weren't present, and the general feeling of being watched. One detail that kept coming up in other accounts but that we hadn't experienced was the smell. Many witnesses described a powerful, skunky odor. We never smelled anything unusual. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that day. Could it have been a hoax? It seems unlikely given how remote the location was. Could it have been a bear walking on its hind legs? The footprints were clearly not bear tracks. They had 5 distinct toes and a human-like shape. Could it have been an unusually large human? The 15-inch footprint would suggest someone over 8 feet tall, and the depth of the impressions indicated significant weight. 20 years later, I still don't have a definitive explanation. Those photos are stored on an old hard drive somewhere in my parents' house. Sometimes I wonder if I should try to find them and share them online, but part of me is reluctant to open that door again. What I do know is that something was there with us that day. Something massive that walked on two legs, was curious about our belongings, and moved through the forest silently enough that we never saw or heard it directly. It's the not knowing, the lingering questions, that still makes me uneasy when I think about it. Whatever walked up to our backpacks that September afternoon in 2002 remains a mystery to me. But every time I hear skeptics dismiss Sasquatch stories outright, I think about those footprints by the creek and that overwhelming feeling of being watched from the tree line. Some things you just can't explain away, no matter how hard you try. Story 3. I can't even talk about that camping trip without my hands getting clammy. It was summer '97, and my Girl Guide group was wrapping up our 3-day trek through the mountains near St. Julian Covec. Back then, I was 14, old enough to think I knew everything, but young enough to still be scared of the dark. Our group had split up that afternoon to collect water and firewood. Most girls went with Madame Tremblay to the creek about half a mile east of our campsite. But me and Sylvie volunteered to stay behind and organize the supplies. We were supposed to consolidate everything since we'd be heading back to the lodge the next morning. I remember it being unusually quiet that day. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just this heavy silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. Sylvie and I had laid out all our rucksacks in a neat row near the fire pit, taking inventory of our remaining supplies. We were sitting with our backs to the dense tree line, about 20 feet from where the forest got really thick. The first thing I noticed was this weird smell. Not like an animal exactly, it was more musky, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I remember wrinkling my nose and asking Sylvie if she smelled it too. She nodded and suggested maybe a raccoon had died nearby. That's when we heard it, twigs snapping behind us in the forest. Not the kind of sound a squirrel or small animal makes. These were deliberate, heavy cracks, like something big was moving just out of sight. "Probably the others coming back early," Sylvie whispered, but her voice trembled. We both knew the water team wouldn't be back for at least another hour. I turned around slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing seemed out of place at first, just the usual mix of pine and maple trees stretching back into darkness. But then I saw movement, about 30 feet in, something ducking behind a large tree trunk. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Madame Tremblay? Is that you?" No response, just more rustling. "Maybe it's a bear," Sylvie whispered, reaching for my arm. Her fingers dug into my skin. "Bears don't hide," I said, though I had no idea if that was true. "They'd just come right at us." We sat frozen for what felt like forever, just staring at those trees. The rustling stopped, and for a moment I thought whatever it was had gone away. I relaxed a bit, turning back to our inventory list. That's when Sylvie gasped. I spun around and saw it, not in the forest anymore, but standing at the edge of our campsite, maybe 15 feet away. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was small, about 4 feet tall, and covered in reddish-brown hair that hung long on its back. It stood on 2 legs but hunched forward with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its face is what got me. Not quite human, not quite animal. The eyes were set deep, dark, but reflecting the afternoon sun in a way that made them look almost aware. Its nose was flat and wide, and its mouth was set in this grimace that showed teeth that seemed too big for its face. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like my whole body just shut down. The thing tilted its head, studying us. Then, without warning, it dropped to all fours and scrambled toward our supply line with surprising speed. Sylvie screamed. The sound broke my paralysis, and I jumped to my feet, pulling her up with me. The creature didn't even look our way. It went straight for our rucksacks, tearing into Agnes's bag first, rummaging through it with hands that looked disturbingly like a person's, but with thick, dirty nails. "Hey!" I shouted, finding my voice. The thing paused, half turning toward us. Food wrappers were clutched in its hands, the chocolate bars Agnes had been hoarding. Something about seeing it stealing our stuff made me angry, cutting through the fear. This wasn't some mystical forest spirit. It was just a thief, a weird, hairy thief. I bent down and grabbed a rock about the size of my fist. "Get away from our stuff, you ugly monster!" I yelled, and threw the rock as hard as I could. I didn't actually expect to hit it. I was never good at sports. But the rock clipped its shoulder and the creature let out this sound. Not quite a yelp, not quite a growl. Something in between that made my stomach turn. It dropped the candy bars and stared right at me. Those eyes, I still see them sometimes when I close my own. Not animal eyes. There was something in there looking back at me. Then it turned and ran. Not like a bear or a deer would run, but not exactly like a person either. It was this awkward, loping gait, arms swinging, disappearing back into the trees within seconds. Sylvie and I stood there, frozen again. "What the fuck was that?" she whispered. I'd never heard her swear before. "I don't know," I replied. "A monkey? Maybe it escaped from somewhere?" Even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. There aren't any monkeys in Quebec, and this thing wasn't like any monkey I'd seen in books or on TV. We approached the rucksacks cautiously. Agnes's bag was torn open, and a few others had been dragged around. Whatever that thing was, it had been looking for food. "Should we tell Madame Tremblay?" Sylvie asked. I considered this. The Girl Guide leader was strict and no nonsense. She'd either think we were making it up for attention, or she'd panic and cut the trip short. Neither option seemed good. "Let's wait," I suggested. "If it comes back, we'll tell her. Otherwise—" Sylvie nodded, understanding. We were both thinking the same thing. No one would believe us. We started cleaning up the mess, trying to fix Agnes's rucksack as best we could. That's when I noticed the ground where the creature had been standing. The soil was soft from rain the previous day, and there were clear impressions, footprints, I guess you'd call them, but not like any footprints I'd ever seen. They were flat, almost rectangular, about 8 inches long and 5 inches wide. No distinct toes, just these odd flat impressions pressed into the mud. I called Sylvie over, and we both stared at them. "We should take a picture," she said. "With what?" I replied. This was 1997. None of us had cameras with us, let alone phones with cameras. Instead, I took out my journal and sketched the prints as best I could. I measured them using my ruler from my school supply kit. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that thing watching us from the trees. By the time the others returned, we'd fixed most of the damage and decided to say a raccoon had gotten into our things. Madame Tremblay scolded us for not hanging the packs properly, and we accepted the blame. That night, though, neither Sylvie nor I slept much. We kept our flashlights close, flicking them on at every sound from the forest. The next morning, we hiked back to the lodge. Everyone was chatting excitedly about the trip, but Sylvie and I were quiet, constantly scanning the trees. I remember feeling watched the entire time. That sensation of eyes following our every move. When we got back to town, Sylvie and I made a pact not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went to the local library and started researching. That's when I found a book about regional folklore and saw an old sketch that made my blood run cold. A petit homme sauvage, or little wild man from Quebec legends. The drawing looked eerily similar to what we'd seen. Deeper research led me to reports of Sasquatch sightings in the region. Most described much larger creatures, 7 or 8 feet tall, but the features were the same. The reddish hair, the flat, wide feet, the 2 human eyes. I realized what we'd seen might have been a young Sasquatch. A child, maybe. The thought that there could be more of them, including full-grown adults, kept me awake for weeks. I didn't go camping again for years after that. Couldn't bring myself to sleep in a tent, knowing what might be watching from the trees. The few times I've tried to tell the story, people either laugh or look concerned, like they're worried about my mental health. Even my husband thinks it's just a story I made up. "Your imagination was always wild," he says when I bring it up. But Sylvie knows. We don't talk much anymore. She moved to Toronto after college. But sometimes she'll call me out of the blue, usually late at night, and all she'll say is, "I still remember." No explanation needed. I know exactly what she means. The strangest part. About 5 years ago, I was watching one of those paranormal investigation shows with my husband. They were doing a segment on Sasquatch sightings in Quebec. One of the experts mentioned that juvenile Sasquatch sightings are incredibly rare, that most reports are of adults. He said no one knows what the young ones look like. I almost called in, almost told them that I knew exactly what a young Sasquatch looks like, that I'd seen one up close enough to hit it with a rock, that they have reddish-brown hair and eyes that look too knowing, that they leave flat footprints 8 by 5 inches in soft soil. But I didn't call. Some things you just can't explain to people who weren't there. They'd want proof I don't have. The memory is proof enough for me. I still scan the trees whenever I'm in the woods. I still sleep with the windows locked, even in summer, and I still wonder about that creature. If it told its family about the human girl who threw a rock at it, if they're out there right now, watching and waiting. Sometimes I think about going back to those woods, setting up a camera. But then I remember those eyes, that almost human face, and I decide some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because if I found proof, if I confirmed what I already know is true, I'm not sure I could ever feel safe in this world again. Story 4. I never believed in cryptids or mythological creatures. Sure, I'd watched those Bigfoot documentaries just like everyone else, and had a good laugh at the grainy footage that could have been a bear or a guy in a costume. But that was before last summer. Before what happened on the drive back from Multnomah Falls, before I saw something that shouldn't exist with my own 2 eyes. My name's Linda Boytson, and my son Ethan and I had spent the day hiking around the falls. It's this gorgeous spot in Oregon that draws tons of tourists, but we'd gone on a weekday when it wasn't so crowded. Ethan had just finished his sophomore year of high school, and I wanted to do something special before he started his summer job at the movie theater. Just some mother-son bonding time, you know. We'd stayed later than planned. The weather was perfect. Warm, but not hot, with this gentle breeze that made hiking actually enjoyable instead of a sweaty nightmare. We'd packed a picnic and eaten by the water, then done the loop trail that gives you those Instagram-worthy views of the falls from different angles. By the time we headed back to the car, the sun was already setting. "We should probably get going," I'd said, checking my watch. It was nearly 8:30 p.m., and we had about an hour's drive back to Portland. Ethan had nodded, busy scrolling through the photos he'd taken on his phone. The drive started normally enough. We stopped for gas at this little station just off the highway, and I grabbed some coffee while Ethan loaded up on snacks. The lady at the counter had given me this weird look when I mentioned we were heading back to Portland. "Taking the scenic route?" she'd asked, her eyes flickering to the darkening sky outside the window. "Just the highway," I'd replied, confused by her question. She'd hesitated, then shrugged. "Just drive careful. Animals get active at night around here." I'd thought she meant deer or elk. Those roadside signs warning about wildlife crossings are all over Oregon highways. If only that had been what she was warning me about. We got back on the road around 9:15 p.m. The highway was practically empty by then. Just a few cars heading in the opposite direction, headlights briefly illuminating our faces before disappearing into the darkness behind us. Ethan had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. His head lolled against the window, the wrapper from his gas station candy bar crumpled in his lap. I had the radio playing softly, some indie station that was starting to break up with static as we got farther from Portland. The coffee was keeping me alert, but I was getting that heavy-eyed feeling that comes after a full day of physical activity. My muscles were pleasantly sore from the hiking, and I was looking forward to a hot shower when we got home. The stretch of highway we were on was winding through dense forest. Tall pines and firs lined both sides of the road, creating this tunnel-like effect. My headlights only illuminated maybe 50 feet ahead, and beyond that was just darkness. The moon was obscured by clouds, and there were no streetlights out there. I was doing about 65 mph, just under the speed limit. The curves in the road meant I couldn't really go much faster safely, especially with the limited visibility. I remember checking the clock on the dashboard. It was 9:47 p.m. That detail stuck with me because it was only seconds later that everything changed. I was approaching a bend in the road, slowing down slightly as I always do, when my headlights swept across something that made my heart literally stop for a second. Standing directly in the slow lane of the highway was a figure, not a person, not an animal I could recognize, something else entirely. My first thought was that someone had put up some kind of scarecrow or prank mannequin, because what I was seeing couldn't possibly be real. It was tall, impossibly tall. Later, when I could think clearly again, I estimated it had to be at least 9 feet in height. But it wasn't just the height that was wrong, it was the proportions. This thing was impossibly thin, like someone had taken a normal body and stretched it vertically while keeping the width the same. But despite its slenderness, I could see the definition of muscles beneath what appeared to be hair or fur covering its entire body. Not the bulky, gorilla-like build you see in Bigfoot documentaries, but lean, sinewy muscle, like an elite marathon runner or swimmer. I had maybe 2 seconds to process what I was seeing as my car barreled toward it at highway speed. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, disproportionately long compared to its torso. The face. God, the face is what haunts me most. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. The eyes caught the reflection of my headlights, glowing briefly like a cat's or deer's, but larger and set deep in a face that had a pronounced brow ridge. I wrenched the steering wheel to the left, swerving into the passing lane while simultaneously stomping on the brakes. The tires screeched, and the car fishtailed slightly. Ethan jerked awake with a startled "Mom!" as the seatbelt locked across his chest. We missed the thing by inches, literally inches. I felt the car shudder slightly, like we might have clipped it with the side mirror, but I wasn't sure. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I was gasping for breath like I'd been underwater. What happened? Did you fall asleep? Ethan was fully awake now, grabbing the dashboard as I struggled to regain control of the car. I couldn't answer him. My eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, where I could see the figure still standing in the road behind us, its head turned to track our movement. It hadn't even attempted to move out of the way. It had just watched us approach. "Mom, you're freaking me out." Ethan's voice sounded far away, like he was speaking through water. "Did you see it?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what? I was asleep." I slowed the car to about 30 mph, but didn't stop. Some primal instinct told me that stopping would be a very, very bad idea. The figure in my rearview mirror was growing smaller as we continued down the highway, but I swear it took a step in our direction before the bend in the road finally took it out of view. "There was something in the road," I said, trying to keep my voice steady for Ethan's sake. "Some kind of, I don't know, an animal, I think." "Like a deer?" Ethan turned to look out the back window, but there was nothing to see now but darkness. "No, not a deer." I couldn't bring myself to say what I really thought it was. It would sound crazy. Hell, it was crazy. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. I kept the speed down and my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Every shadow at the edge of the trees made my heart rate spike. Every curve in the road brought a fresh wave of dread that there might be another one standing there, waiting. Ethan must have sensed my panic because he stayed quiet for most of the drive, only occasionally asking if I was okay. I'd nod without taking my eyes off the road, not trusting my voice not to betray the fear coursing through me. When we finally reached the outskirts of Portland, with streetlights and other cars around us, I began to breathe a little easier. But the image of that thing was burned into my mind, the impossibly elongated limbs, the lean musculature visible beneath the hair covering its body, the eyes reflecting my headlights. We got home around 10:45 p.m. I remember because I checked the time as soon as we pulled into the driveway, calculating that it had been almost exactly an hour since the encounter. An hour that had seemed like a lifetime. I fumbled with my keys at the front door, my hand still shaking slightly. Once inside, I locked the door, then checked it twice to make sure it was secure. I did the same with all the windows and the back door, drawing the curtains tight against the darkness outside. "Mom, seriously, what's going on?" Ethan followed me around as I performed this security check, concern etched on his face. "You're acting really weird." I took a deep breath and sat down at the kitchen table, motioning for him to join me. "I saw something on the highway," I began, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane. Something that shouldn't exist. I told him everything then. How tall it was, how unnaturally thin yet muscular, the way it stood perfectly still in the middle of the lane, not reacting as our car barreled toward it, the glint of its eyes in our headlights. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from concern to disbelief, and finally to a kind of cautious acceptance that I hadn't completely lost my mind. "You think it was a Sasquatch?" he finally asked when I'd finished. "Like Bigfoot?" "I don't know what it was," I admitted. "It didn't look like the Bigfoot you see in pictures or documentaries. Those are always shown as these massive, bulky creatures. This was different, thinner, like it had been stretched." Ethan pulled out his phone and started typing. "There are stories of different types," he said after a moment of scrolling. "Not all sightings describe the same kind of creature." I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in my headlights. I kept thinking about how close we'd come to hitting it, or it letting us hit it. Because one detail I couldn't shake was that it had made no attempt to move. It had just stood there watching us approach, as if it were curious what we would do. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the idea of telling people what I'd seen. They'd think I was crazy or that I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing up. But I know what I saw. I did make one call, though, to that gas station where we'd stopped for coffee. I asked to speak to the woman who had been working the counter the night before. "You made it home, okay?" she asked when she came to the phone, recognition in her voice. "We did," I said, hesitating before adding, "but we saw something on the highway." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Tall?" she finally asked. "Standing in the road?" My blood ran cold. "Yes." She sighed heavily. "Don't tell anyone else. They won't believe you anyway." Have you seen it too?" Another pause. "Not me personally, but there've been stories. Truckers mostly, few tourists. Always at night, always on that same stretch of highway." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Nobody knows," she replied simply. "But it's been there a long time." She hung up after that, and when I tried calling back, someone else answered and said she had left for the day. It's been 3 months now since that night. I've told exactly 3 people what I saw. Ethan, that gas station attendant, and now whoever's reading this. I've avoided driving that highway since then, taking the longer route when we need to go east of Portland. I've looked online for similar sightings, for any mention of an unusually thin, tall creature in the forests of Oregon. There's very little. A few obscure forum posts describing something similar, all in the same general area. A single blurry photo that could be anything, but which shows a tall, slender shape at the edge of a tree line. What bothers me most isn't just that I saw something that shouldn't exist. It's that it seemed to be deliberately placing itself in our path. Standing in the middle of a highway at night isn't natural behavior for any animal trying to survive. It feels intentional, like it wanted to be seen, or worse, like it was testing us, studying our reaction. I keep thinking about its body, how despite being unnaturally thin, every muscle was perfectly defined. Not the body of something starving or sick, but something evolved to be that way, something adapted to an environment we know nothing about. Sometimes at night, I find myself standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the distant tree line that marks the beginning of the forests that cover so much of this state. And I wonder if it's out there right now, standing at the edge of someone else's headlights, watching and waiting. For what, I don't know. And I don't want to find out. Story 5. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to me last fall in Coos County. I've always been the skeptical type, someone who needs hard evidence before believing in anything supernatural. But what I experienced in those New Hampshire woods has completely shattered my worldview. It was mid-October, and I decided to take advantage of the perfect hiking weather before winter set in. I'd recently moved to a small town in Coos County for work, a tech job that let me work remotely. The isolation was exactly what I wanted after a messy breakup and the stress of city life. My neighbor Earl, an old-timer who'd lived in the area his whole life, had recommended several hiking trails. When I mentioned I was planning to explore the deeper parts of the forest, his expression changed. He got this worried look and started telling me about wood devils, creatures his grandparents and parents had warned him about. According to Earl, they were tall, unnaturally thin beings that hid against trees and watched people. I laughed it off as local folklore, the kind of story small towns pass down through generations. Earl didn't laugh along with me. He just nodded and said, "Just stick to the marked trails, that's all." I should have listened. That morning started perfectly. Crisp air, stunning fall colors, and a cloudless sky. I parked at the trailhead around 8 a.m., planning to do a 10-mile loop that would take me through some of the more remote areas. I had my backpack with water, trail mix, a first aid kit, my phone, though reception was spotty at best, and a detailed map of the area. I even took a selfie at the trailhead to send to my sister later, something I now look at with an eerie feeling. The first couple hours were uneventful. The trail was well maintained for the first few miles, winding through spectacular foliage. I'm not typically the emotional type, but there was something about being alone in those woods that felt deeply calming. Around 11 a.m., I reached a fork, where the main trail continued to loop back toward the parking area, while a narrower path headed deeper into the forest. The narrow path wasn't on my original plan, but it was marked on the map, and I was feeling adventurous. This is where things started to change. As I ventured down this lesser-used trail, the forest seemed to get denser. The sunlight that had been streaming through the trees earlier was now just thin beams breaking through the canopy. I noticed the birds had stopped singing, which I initially attributed to the time of day. Now I realize it was the first warning sign. About a mile down this trail, I got the distinct feeling I was being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It was like that, but intense. I stopped and looked around, seeing nothing but trees and undergrowth. I called out, thinking maybe another hiker was nearby, but the only response was my voice echoing slightly before being swallowed by the forest. I continued walking, now more alert. The trail started to become less defined, and I had to check my map more frequently. Around noon, I stopped for lunch on a fallen log. As I sat there eating my sandwich, I kept scanning the forest. That's when I noticed something odd about a tree about 50 yards away. It didn't look quite right. It appeared to have a strange protrusion or growth. I squinted, trying to make it out better, but the distance and shadows made it difficult. Curiosity got the better of me. I packed up my lunch and walked toward the tree. As I got closer, the growth seemed to shift slightly. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, there was nothing unusual about the tree. I circled it, examining the bark, feeling a bit foolish for getting spooked by normal forest shadows. When I turned to head back to the trail, I froze. About 20 yards ahead stood another tree, but this one definitely had something next to it. Something tall and impossibly thin. The shape was grey against the brown bark, and for a split second I thought it might be some kind of forest ranger in a grey uniform. But then it moved. It didn't move like a person. It glided sideways, keeping the tree perfectly between us. I could only catch glimpses, a long, thin arm, what looked like matted hair, and the overall impression of something that was trying very hard not to be seen. My heart hammered in my chest. I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice came out shakier than I intended. No response. I took a few steps forward, and the figure shifted again, always keeping the tree as a barrier. It was so unnaturally fluid that my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I remembered Earl's words about wood devils, and how they would reposition themselves to remain hidden. "I can see you," I said, trying to sound confident despite my rising panic. "What do you want?" The forest had become completely silent. No rustling leaves, no distant bird calls, nothing. Just me and whatever was hiding behind that tree. I decided to approach from a different angle, moving laterally to try to get a better view. As I did, the figure moved too, maintaining the perfect alignment between itself, the tree, and me. This wasn't random movement. This was calculated, intelligent. My curiosity was now completely overshadowed by fear. I backed away slowly, planning to return to the main trail. As I retreated, I kept my eyes fixed on that tree. The figure remained still until I had backed up about 30 feet. Then it seemed to slip around to the other side of the trunk. I turned and started walking quickly back toward where I thought the trail was. After a few minutes of half walking, half jogging, I realized I couldn't find the path. The forest looked the same in every direction, endless trees, fallen leaves, and undergrowth. I pulled out my map and tried to orient myself, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "You're just spooked," I told myself. It was probably just a deer or something. But I knew deer don't stand upright or move the way that thing moved. I picked a direction that seemed right and started walking purposefully. After about 10 minutes, I glanced back over my shoulder. That's when I saw it again. This time it was about 100 feet behind me, standing perfectly still next to a large pine tree. From this distance, I could make out more details. It was easily 7 feet tall, but so thin it looked almost two-dimensional from certain angles. Its skin, or was it hair, was a dull grey colour that blended with the tree bark in the shadowy forest. Its limbs were disproportionately long, especially its arms, which hung down almost to what would be its knees. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I had the distinct impression it was watching me intently. Not like a curious animal, but like something studying its prey. I broke into a run. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted distance between me and that thing. I sprinted through the forest, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. After running for what felt like forever, I stopped, gasping for breath, and leaned against a tree. When I looked up, my blood ran cold. There it was, about 50 feet ahead of me, standing beside another tree. How had it gotten in front of me? I had been running full speed. Had it circled around? Or were there more than one of these things? This time I got a better look at its face, as a beam of sunlight briefly illuminated it. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways that are hard to describe. The proportions were off, eyes too far apart, jaw too narrow. It had a nose, but it was flat and almost vestigial. The mouth was what disturbed me most, a thin line that extended too far across what should have been cheeks. Our eyes met, at least I think they did. And in that moment, I felt a primal terror unlike anything I've ever experienced. This wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was recognition that I was in the presence of something that existed completely outside my understanding of the natural world. I backed away slowly, not wanting to trigger a chase. The creature remained still, watching me. Then, as I took another step back, my foot came down on a dry branch. The crack echoed through the silent forest. The wood devil reacted instantly. It let out a sound that I still hear in my nightmares, a high-pitched, almost mechanical scream that seemed to reverberate inside my skull. It wasn't just loud, it felt invasive, like it was piercing straight into my brain. I ran again, this time with no plan or direction, just pure adrenaline-fueled escape. I crashed through underbrush, scrambled over fallen trees, and splashed through a small stream. I didn't stop until my lungs were burning and my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally paused, I was in a small clearing. The sun was lower in the sky. It must have been around 3 or 4 p.m. I'd lost track of time completely. My phone showed no service, and the battery was down to 20%. The map was crumpled and torn from being hastily stuffed in and out of my pocket. I tried to get my bearings, looking for any landmark that might help me find my way back to the trailhead. That's when I noticed them. At the edges of the clearing, partially hidden behind trees, were 3 distinct grey figures. They stood completely motionless, so still that if you weren't looking directly at them, you might mistake them for peculiar shadows or tree trunks. They had surrounded me. I stood frozen in the center of the clearing, turning slowly to keep all 3 in view as best I could. They didn't approach, but whenever I looked directly at one, it would slide behind its tree, only to reappear when my attention shifted elsewhere. They were toying with me. The sun was getting lower, and I knew being in these woods after dark with these things was not an option. I had to make a move. I chose the direction where the forest seemed least dense and started walking deliberately toward it. As I approached the edge of the clearing, the wood devil stationed there moved further behind its tree, maintaining that perfect alignment I'd noticed earlier. I picked up my pace, pushing past the tree line and into the forest again. Looking back, I saw the grey figure step away from the tree, fully visible for the first time. It was even more terrifying in full view, impossibly gaunt, with joints that bent at unnatural angles. It took a step toward me, moving with an odd, fluid grace that no human could replicate. Then it started to run. I've never seen anything move that fast through dense forest. It weaved between trees, ducked under branches, and leaped over obstacles with unnatural agility. I ran too, pushing my body beyond what I thought possible, driven by pure terror. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to distort. The forest was getting darker as the sun set, and I was losing hope of finding my way out before nightfall. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, tumbling down a slight incline and landing in a heap at the bottom. As I lay there dazed and in pain, I heard something moving through the forest, toward me. Not the frantic crashing you'd expect from a panicked animal or person, but deliberate, calculated movement. It was tracking me. I struggled to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ankle. I twisted it in the fall, not badly enough to prevent walking, but enough to slow me down significantly. I limped forward, knowing I couldn't outrun the wood devil in this condition. That's when I saw it, through the trees ahead, the fading sunlight reflected off metal, a road or a car, something man-made. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I hobbled toward it as quickly as I could. Behind me, that terrible scream sounded again, closer this time. It was followed by 2 more screams from different directions. They were converging on me. I broke through the tree line and found myself on the edge of a small rural road. About 100 yards to my left, I could see my car parked at the trailhead. Somehow, I'd come full circle. I limped toward my car as fast as I could, constantly glancing back at the forest edge. The wood devils had stopped at the tree line. They stood there, half hidden as always, watching me retreat. Even from this distance, I could feel their eyes on me. When I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly, I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in my rearview mirror. One of the wood devils had stepped fully out of the forest and was standing in the middle of the road, watching my car disappear around the bend. This final glimpse was the clearest view I had, and what I saw has haunted me ever since. It stood upright like a human, but was nothing like us, a grey, emaciated figure with limbs that seemed too long and jointed in the wrong places. Its face, even from that distance, was clearly not human. I drove straight home and locked every door and window. I was so shaken I couldn't even call anyone who would believe me. The next morning, I convinced myself I had experienced some kind of stress-induced hallucination, but three things prevent me from dismissing what happened. First, the physical evidence. My torn clothes, the scratches on my arms and face from branches, and the sprained ankle that took weeks to heal. Second, when I finally worked up the courage to talk to Earl about what happened, his face went pale. He told me his grandfather had a nearly identical encounter in the 1930s. The details matched too precisely to be coincidence. Third, and most disturbing, is what I found when I looked at the selfie I took at the trailhead that morning. In the background, partially hidden behind a tree about 50 yards behind me, is a tall, thin, grey figure. It was watching me from the very beginning. I've moved away from Coos County since then. I can't bring myself to go hiking anymore, and the sound of rustling trees makes my heart race. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear that high-pitched mechanical scream in the distance, and I know, with absolute certainty, that the wood devils are real, they're intelligent, and for some reason, they let me go that day. I don't know why they didn't attack. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were warning me to stay out of their territory. Or maybe they were simply enjoying the game of terror they were playing with me. Whatever the reason, I know one thing for certain. I am never going back to those woods again. Story 6. I still can't believe what happened that night in February 1972. It's been over 50 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My hands are shaking even as I type this out, but I need to share what happened. Maybe someone out there has seen the same thing and can help me make sense of it all. I was 19 back then, living in Bakersfield, California. Me and 3 of my friends, Mark, Diane, and Steve, decided to go camping at Lake Isabella for the weekend. Mark had a beat-up Chevy van that could fit all our gear, and February meant fewer crowds, which was perfect for us. We were young, thought we knew everything, and were looking for some fun away from our parents and the daily grind. None of us were big outdoors people, to be honest. We just wanted somewhere to hang out, drink a few beers, and enjoy being away from civilization for a bit. Lake Isabella was only about an hour east of Bakersfield, up in the Sierra Nevada foothills, so it was close enough that we could handle it even with our limited camping experience. We arrived at the campground on Friday afternoon. It was unusually warm for February, one of those California winter days that reminds you why people put up with the state's problems. We found a spot that was pretty secluded, about a quarter-mile from the nearest occupied campsite. The campground was maybe 20% full at most. The site we chose was nestled in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a dirt path leading down to the lake about 200 yards away. We spent that afternoon setting up our tent, gathering firewood, and getting our little campsite organized. Steve had brought his portable radio, and we listened to music while we worked. By evening, we had a decent fire going and were cooking hot dogs on sticks, drinking cheap beer, and telling stupid jokes. Normal camping stuff. Nothing weird happened that first night. We stayed up late, looked at the stars, and eventually crashed in our tent. Saturday was when things started to feel off. We'd planned to spend the day swimming and fishing at the lake, But there was this weird atmosphere from the moment we woke up. Mark was the first to mention it. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" he asked while we made breakfast. None of us had, but the way he asked made me uneasy. He said he thought he'd heard something large moving around outside the tent around 3 a.m. He figured it was probably a deer or maybe even a bear, though bears should have been hibernating that time of year. We brushed it off. Mark had always been jumpy and had probably just heard a raccoon or something. But as the day went on, I kept getting this feeling like we were being watched. I'd look up from whatever I was doing and scan the tree line, but never saw anything. I didn't mention it to the others because I didn't want to seem paranoid. But there was this heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. We hiked down to the lake around noon. The water was too cold for swimming, but Steve and Mark tried fishing for a bit, while Diane and I sat on some rocks soaking up the sun. That's when we noticed we were the only people at this part of the lake. In the distance, maybe half a mile away, we could see some other campers, but our section was completely empty. "Where is everyone?" Diane asked. "Even for February, this seems empty." I agreed it was weird, but figured maybe this just wasn't a popular spot in winter. Still, the isolation was starting to get to me a little. As the afternoon wore on, even Diane started acting jumpy. She kept saying she felt like someone was staring at her. Steve laughed it off, saying she'd been watching too many horror movies. But I knew what she meant. I'd been feeling it too. We headed back to our campsite around 4 p.m. as the sun was starting to set. That's when we noticed something strange. Our campsite had been disturbed, not ransacked or anything dramatic, but things were moved. The cooler we'd left on the picnic table was now on the ground. The camp chairs were rearranged, and weirdest of all, some of our food supplies were missing, specifically a package of bacon and some apples. "Probably raccoons," Steve said, but he didn't sound convinced. Raccoons would have torn into everything, not selectively taken certain foods, and left the packaging nowhere to be found. Mark was visibly nervous now. "Maybe we should pack up and head back to Bakersfield tonight," he suggested, but the idea of driving those winding mountain roads in the dark didn't appeal to any of us. Besides, we'd paid for 2 nights, and I think we all had too much pride to admit we were spooked by what was probably just some local animals. So we rebuilt our fire, bigger this time, and tried to shake off the weird vibes with more beer and loud conversation. As darkness fell completely, we huddled closer to the fire. The moon was nearly full that night, which gave everything this eerie silver glow. The trees around our campsite cast long shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. Around 9 p.m., we heard the first unusual sound, a sort of low whooping noise from the direction of the lake. It wasn't a bird or any animal I recognized. It sounded almost human, but not quite. The 4 of us froze, all conversation stopping mid-sentence. "What the hell was that?" Diane whispered. "Probably an owl," Steve said, but he was standing now, peering into the darkness beyond our fire's light. The sound came again, slightly closer this time. Then silence for maybe 15 minutes. We tried to go back to our conversations, but nobody was relaxed anymore. We spoke in hushed tones, all of us straining to listen for any unusual sounds. That's when we heard the footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps moving through the underbrush at the edge of our campsite. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a raccoon or even a deer. The footsteps had weight to them, making twigs snap and dead leaves crunch. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps stopped. We sat in tense silence for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then the footsteps started again, moving slowly around the perimeter of our campsite, just beyond where the firelight reached. Whatever it was circling us. "It's probably a bear," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. "Make some noise, guys. Bears will run away if they know humans are here." I started clapping my hands and the others joined in, yelling and banging on pots with spoons. The footsteps retreated, and we all let out a collective sigh of relief. Steve suggested we take turns keeping watch through the night, and we all quickly agreed. I volunteered to take the first shift while the others tried to get some sleep in the tent. Sitting alone by the fire, trying to keep it stoked and bright, was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of branches made my heart race. I kept the flashlight in one hand and Mark's hunting knife in the other, though I knew neither would do much good against a bear if it decided to charge. My 2-hour shift passed without incident, and I woke Steve for his turn. I crawled into the tent, exhausted, but wound up tight with anxiety. I must have eventually drifted off, because the next thing I knew, Steve was shaking me awake, his face pale in the beam of the flashlight. "It's back," he whispered, "and it's not a bear." I crawled out of the tent, careful not to wake Diane and Mark. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting very little light now. The moon was high overhead, bathing everything in that silvery light. Steve pointed toward the tree line opposite the path to the lake. "I saw it standing there," he said. "Just watching for like 10 minutes straight." "What did it look like?" I asked, my mouth dry. Steve hesitated. "Tall. Really tall. Standing on 2 legs. I thought it was a person at first, but it was covered in hair. I could see it in the moonlight." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Did it do anything?" "It just watched. Then it moved back into the trees when I stood up." We decided to wake Mark and Diane. Nobody was going to be sleeping anymore anyway. As we turned toward the tent, we heard it again. That weird whooping sound, followed by what sounded almost like speech, but no language I'd ever heard. A series of grunts and moans that had structure to them, like they meant something, and they were coming from right behind our tent. Mark and Diane came scrambling out before we could even call to them. Diane was crying silently, and Mark looked like he might throw up. "Something pushed against the tent," he stammered, "like pressed up against it right where our heads were." We all stood with our backs to the dying fire, scanning the tree line frantically. That's when I saw it for the first time. A large figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partly hidden by a pine tree. In the moonlight, I could make out its silhouette. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a bulky frame. And it was just standing there, watching us. "Holy shit," Steve whispered. "Do you guys see that?" We all nodded, too terrified to speak louder. The figure didn't move. "What do we do?" Diane asked, her voice barely audible. "Get to the van," Mark said. "Slowly. Don't run." We started backing toward where the van was parked, about 50 feet away, never taking our eyes off the figure in the trees. I fumbled in my pocket for the flashlight and finally managed to turn it on, pointing the beam in the direction of the figure. For just a split second, the light illuminated it before it stepped behind the tree. But that split second was enough for me to see something I'll never forget. It was covered in thick, reddish-brown hair. Not fur like a bear. Hair, more like a human's, but all over its body. Its face was flat and broad, with deep-set eyes that reflected my flashlight beam with a reddish glow. And it was looking right at us with what seemed like intelligence. Then it was gone, moving with surprising speed and silence behind the tree line. We made it to the van, piling in and locking the doors. Mark tried to start the engine, but it just made a clicking noise. "No, no, no," he muttered, trying again. "Same result. The battery's dead or something." We sat in stunned silence. We were trapped, at least until morning when someone might come by, or until we could flag down help from another campsite. "What the hell was that thing?" Diane asked, her voice shaking. None of us had an answer, but we were all thinking the same thing. The stories we'd heard, but never really believed. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you wanted to give it. "We need to stay in the van until daylight," I said. "Then we'll walk to the ranger station if we have to." For the next several hours, we sat huddled in that van, jumping at every sound from outside. Sometimes we'd hear those footsteps again, circling the van. Occasionally, there would be a light thump against the side, as if it was testing the vehicle. At one point, something heavy stepped onto the hood, making the whole van dip down on its front suspension. Through the windshield, we could see nothing but that reddish-brown hair pressed against the glass. Diane screamed, and the creature immediately jumped off, disappearing into the darkness again. Around 4 a.m., the strangest thing happened. The whooping calls started again, but this time they were answered by similar calls from farther away. There were more of them out there. "It's calling its friends," Steve whispered, and I felt a chill run down my spine. For the next hour, we could hear movement all around the campsite. Heavy footsteps, strange vocalizations, the sounds of our remaining supplies being rummaged through. We sat frozen in the van, afraid to even look out the windows. As the first light of dawn began to brighten the sky, the sounds gradually stopped. We waited until full daylight before cautiously stepping out of the van. Our campsite was destroyed. The tent had been flattened. Our supplies were scattered everywhere. Large footprints, barefoot but human-like, easily 16-18 inches long, were pressed into the soft ground all around the site. Mark tried the van again, and miraculously, it started this time. We threw what remained of our gear into the back and got the hell out of there, not even bothering to check out at the ranger station. We were too afraid they'd make us file a report, and honestly, who would believe us? On the drive back to Bakersfield, we all swore not to tell anyone what we'd seen. Who would believe 4 teenagers claiming they were surrounded by Bigfoot creatures all night? We'd be laughed out of town. But a few weeks later, I read a small article in the Bakersfield newspaper about a new organization called the California Bigfoot Organization, investigating sightings in our area. I was tempted to contact them to tell them what we'd seen, but fear of ridicule kept me silent. Over the years, I've read about similar encounters in those same mountains. I've seen documentaries about Sasquatch that describe behaviors identical to what we experienced. The wood knocking, the strange calls, the circling of campsites, the way they seem to communicate with each other. I'm still not sure what exactly happened that night at Lake Isabella. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just bears, or maybe even people playing a twisted prank. But then I remember those eyes reflecting red in my flashlight beam. I remember the intelligence I saw there, and I know whatever watched us that night wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal animal either. None of us ever went camping again. Not once in all these years. And to this day, I can't sleep without the lights on. I've never told this story publicly before, but I'm getting older now, and I feel like someone should know what happened. Maybe someone else out there has seen the same things and stayed quiet too. Maybe we're not crazy after all. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that figure standing in the trees watching us. And I wake up wondering if somewhere in those mountains it might be remembering us too. Story 7. I still get chills thinking about that night in March 1973. It's been decades, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, thinking I'm back there again. I was 19 at the time, living with my mom and stepdad in a trailer on East 115th Street in Lancaster. It was a quiet area back then, lots of open space between properties. We had these 2 dogs that would run around freely. Nobody really kept their pets tied up back then. That night I was babysitting for my sister's kids. Nothing unusual, just a normal Friday night. Her youngest had been sick with a fever, so I stayed later than planned to help her get him settled. By the time I finally left, it was almost 2 a.m. The drive home was quiet. Lancaster was always dead at that hour. I remember the moon was incredibly bright that night, bright enough that I could see the outline of Joshua trees and scrub brush against the sky as I drove. It was almost unnaturally bright. which I guess turned out to be a blessing and a curse. When I pulled up to our place, I noticed right away that something was off. I could hear one of our dogs whining, this weird, high-pitched sound I'd never heard him make before. Not barking, not growling, just this desperate whimpering. My first thought was maybe he'd gotten hurt somehow, maybe tangled in barbed wire or hit by a car. I parked and got out trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Our trailer was small, about 8 feet tall at its highest point, and sat on this little plot with some sparse grass and dirt around it. I could see the dog wasn't in the immediate area around the trailer, but I could still hear him. Following the sound, I walked maybe 100 feet away toward this telephone pole where there was a patch of slightly taller grass. The whining seemed to be coming from that direction. The moonlight was so bright I could see pretty clearly without a flashlight. I was calling the dog's name, Rusty, here boy, in this soft voice, not wanting to wake up the neighbors. I remember I was wearing these stupid platform shoes that were popular then, and the heels kept sinking into the soft dirt as I walked. When I got about 20 feet from the grassy area, the whining suddenly stopped. Complete silence. Something about that silence made the hair on my arms stand up. I hesitated for a second, but I was worried about Rusty, so I kept going. That's when it happened. The grass in front of me moved, not like wind blowing through it, more like something massive shifting underneath it. I froze. Then this thing rose up from the ground. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It just didn't make sense. This huge, dark shape unfolding itself from the ground, getting taller and taller until it was almost as tall as our trailer. 7 feet at least, maybe more. It had been lying down in the grass, and now it was standing. Not standing straight up like a person, it had this hunched posture, but definitely on 2 legs, and it was wide. My stepdad's friend Rich later asked me to compare, and Rich was a big guy, 6'6", and built like a football player, but this thing was way wider across the shoulders and chest. The moonlight was hitting it just right, and I could see it was covered in hair. Not fur like a bear, longer, shaggier hair that hung from its arms and shoulders. Dark hair, maybe dark brown or black. It was hard to tell in the moonlight, but the face had less hair. I couldn't make out features clearly, but I remember thinking it looked almost human-like, but not human. The proportions were all wrong. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't even scream. My mouth was open, but nothing would come out. Then it turned. Not quickly, not like it was startled or scared. It just deliberately turned away from me and started walking. Walking on 2 legs, with this weird, fluid gait that wasn't quite human, but wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen either. It didn't run, it didn't charge at me. It just walked away toward the old reservoir area near 110th Street. That's when my paralysis broke. I turned and ran. I've never run so fast in my life, especially in those stupid platform shoes. I sprinted back to our trailer, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. I was so terrified I forgot I had my house key. I reached the trailer and just started pounding on the door, screaming for my stepdad. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even get the key out of my purse. I just kept looking over my shoulder, sure that thing was coming after me. My stepdad finally opened the door, looking confused and angry at being woken up. One look at my face, though, and he knew something was seriously wrong. I collapsed inside, hyperventilating, trying to explain what I'd seen. I must have sounded like a lunatic, babbling about a giant hairy man thing by the telephone pole, but my stepdad knew me. He knew I wasn't the type to make things up or get spooked easily. I'd lived in Lancaster my whole life. I knew what coyotes looked like, what bears looked like. This wasn't any of those things. He grabbed his rifle, an old hunting rifle he kept loaded in the closet, and went outside. My mum stayed with me while I cried and shook on the couch. I couldn't stop shaking. It wasn't just fear. It was like my body was having some kind of reaction to what I'd seen, something that just didn't fit into my understanding of the world. My stepdad stayed out there with his rifle until sunrise, walking the property, checking the area where I'd seen the thing. He didn't find anything that night. No footprints, no broken vegetation, nothing. Rusty came home the next morning unharmed, but acting strange and clingy. Our other dog was nowhere to be found for 2 days. When he finally came back, he had a weird, skittish look in his eyes that never really went away. I didn't sleep at all that night, or the next night. For weeks afterward, I'd wake up in a panic, thinking I heard something outside the trailer. I refused to go outside after dark. I quit babysitting for my sister because I couldn't handle the drive home late at night. A few days after it happened, my stepdad heard about this group called the California Bigfoot Organization. He reached out to them, not telling me at first because he thought I'd be upset. This guy named Rich Grumley came out to talk to me. He was this huge guy, like I mentioned before, 6'6" and 253 pounds. He told us his exact weight, but when I told him the thing I saw was wider than him, he didn't laugh or look skeptical. He just nodded, like he'd heard it before. Rich asked me a ton of questions. What time exactly, what the weather was like, which direction it went, how it moved. I remember feeling so relieved that someone was taking me seriously. He recorded everything I said on this little tape recorder. The weirdest part came when Rich went looking around the old reservoir near 110th Street, where I'd seen the thing heading. He found these tracks, not clear footprints, but these weird impressions in the mud. The toes were spread out really wide, like a fan, nothing like human footprints, nothing like any animal prints I'd ever seen. Rich took plaster casts of them. When he showed them to me later, that sick feeling came back. Those were not made by anything I recognized. For months afterward, there were rumors around Lancaster. A couple other people reported seeing something similar. A man who lived about a mile away said something had torn apart his chicken coop, but didn't take any chickens, just destroyed it like it was angry. Someone else reported hearing weird howling sounds at night. But eventually, like all local stories, it faded away. People moved on. I tried to as well, but I never really could. I know what I saw that night. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else. I've spent years trying to make sense of it. I've read books about Bigfoot sightings, joined online forums, even gone to a couple of those Sasquatch conventions. Some of the stories I've heard are obviously fake, people looking for attention, but others sound just like what happened to me. Even now, I can't drive past that area at night. I moved away from Lancaster for college and never moved back. My mom and stepdad sold the trailer a few years later. I've never told my husband the full story. He knows something happened that scared me, but I've never given him the details. How do you tell someone something like that without sounding crazy? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. If maybe the moonlight and shadows played tricks on my eyes. If maybe it was just some weird, tall guy trespassing on our property. But then I remember the width of it. The way it moved, the way the hair hung from its arms, the weird, not quite human face. And I know what I saw was real. I'm almost 70 years old now. I've never seen anything like it again. But to this day, I still check the shadows outside my windows before I go to bed. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, heart racing, thinking I hear that same whimpering sound our dog made. Whatever I saw that night in 1973 was real. And sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, somewhere in the hills around Lancaster, watching and waiting in the tall grass. Story 8. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but after sitting on it for months, I need to get it off my chest. Maybe writing it down will help me process what happened. I still get chills thinking about it, and sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear those heavy footsteps outside my window. It happened last October when I was working for the California Bigfoot Organization. Yeah, I know how that sounds, trust me. I wasn't some true believer who joined because I was obsessed with finding Bigfoot. I needed a job, and they needed someone who knew the terrain around Palmdale. I'd grown up camping and hiking in those areas, so it was a good fit. Plus, the pay wasn't terrible, and I figured it'd be interesting work even if we never found anything. Most of our investigations were pretty routine, following up on reports from hikers or campers who thought they saw something weird, checking out supposed footprints that usually turned out to be bear tracks or hoaxes, that kind of thing. I'd been with the CBFO for about 8 months, and honestly, I was starting to think about finding a different job. Not because I didn't like the people, they were great, but because it felt like we were chasing shadows. Then came that day in October. It was unusually cool for that time of year, maybe high 50s in the morning when we headed out. Rich Grumley was leading our team that day. Rich is a good guy, probably in his late 40s, about 6'4", and built like a linebacker. He'd been with the organization for years and had a reputation for being methodical and skeptical. He wasn't the type to get excited about every broken twig or unusual sound. We were investigating a report from a woman named Kim MacDonald, who'd seen something near her property a week earlier. She described a tall, hairy figure walking through the scrub at dusk. Normally, I'd dismiss something like that as a bear, or maybe just a tall guy hiking. But Rich seemed to take it seriously because of the specific details she provided about the way it moved. Our plan was simple. Check the area around Kim's property, then expand outward into the desert to look for any signs. I remember thinking it was going to be another wasted day as we packed our gear into Rich's truck. The area we were investigating was typical high desert terrain, lots of scrub brush, Joshua trees, and open spaces with rolling hills. It was about 20 minutes outside Palmdale proper, where the houses give way to scattered properties and then just wilderness. Kim's place sat at the edge of this transition, the last house before a whole lot of nothing. After speaking with Kim again, she was still visibly shaken from whatever she'd seen. We started our search pattern. For the first few hours, it was the usual nothing. Some animal tracks, mostly coyote and rabbit, but nothing unusual. Around 1 p.m., Rich found the first prints. I remember the moment clearly because of how his demeanor changed. Rich isn't easily impressed, but when he called me over, his voice had this tension I'd never heard before. "Ron, take a look at this," he said, crouching next to what looked like a partial footprint in a patch of sandy soil. I knelt beside him and felt my stomach drop. The print was huge, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. It had a distinct heel and 5 toe impressions. But what really got me was that it wasn't alone. There was another one, and another after that, forming a path heading northwest. "What do you think made these?" I asked, already knowing what Rich was thinking. "I don't know yet," he said carefully, "but let's measure the stride." We took out the measuring tape, and that's when things got really weird. The distance between prints was between 5 and 6 feet. Let me emphasize this, 5 to 6 feet between steps. Even Rich, who's a tall guy, couldn't come close to matching that stride. When he tried, he had to jump to cover the distance. "Whatever made these was big," Rich said, photographing each print methodically, "and it was walking, not running." We followed the tracks for nearly half a mile. They never deviated from a straight line, as if whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. Eventually, they disappeared where the ground became too rocky to hold impressions. Rich wanted to split up to cover more ground. In hindsight, that was probably a mistake, but neither of us was thinking clearly at that point. We were too caught up in the excitement of finding something genuinely unusual. I took the western path, following a dry wash that curved around a small ridge. Rich headed north, planning to circle back and meet me in about an hour. I had my radio, camera, and water bottle. It was about 3 p.m. now, and the temperature had climbed into the mid-70s. The wash narrowed as I walked, with steep banks on either side. I was taking pictures of anything that looked remotely interesting, mostly to justify the hours I was billing. About 20 minutes into my solo hike, I came to a place where the wash widened into a small clearing. There were a couple of old telephone poles running along one side, remnants of some abandoned utility line. I sat down on a rock to drink some water and check my GPS. That's when I heard it, a sound like gravel shifting. Not a dramatic noise, just enough to make me look up. And there it was. Standing next to one of the telephone poles about 60 yards away was something I still struggle to describe in a way that does it justice. It was tall. God, it was tall. I'm 5'11", and this thing would have towered over me. 8 feet at minimum, maybe more. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like the hair on a gorilla but longer in places, especially around the shoulders. The color wasn't uniform black, but more of a dark brown with some lighter patches. Its build was massive, with incredibly broad shoulders and a thick torso, but the thing that struck me most was how small its head looked in proportion to its body. Not tiny, but definitely smaller than you'd expect for something that size. I froze, completely froze. My water bottle slipped from my hand and rolled across the rock, making a small noise that seemed deafening in that moment. The figure turned toward me, and I got a better look at its face. It wasn't ape-like as I'd always imagined Bigfoot would be. It had a flatter face, more human-like in some ways, with a pronounced brow ridge. Its eyes were dark and set deep, and I couldn't make out much detail from that distance, but I could tell it was looking directly at me. Then it did something so unexpected and so human that it broke through my terror momentarily. It sneezed, just like a person would sneeze, a normal achoo sound that echoed slightly in the clearing. I remember thinking, absurdly, Bigfoot has allergies. After that sneeze, it seemed to study me for a moment longer. I was still frozen in place, unable to reach for my camera or radio. Some primal part of my brain was screaming that any movement might provoke it. Then, with a casualness that was somehow more terrifying than if it had charged or roared, it simply turned and walked away. Its gait was smooth and deliberate, each footstep making a distinct thumping sound on the hard ground. It didn't hurry, didn't look back, just walked with the confidence of something that fears absolutely nothing in its environment. As it moved, I noticed something about its feet that I hadn't seen in the tracks. The toes seemed split or spread wide apart, like they were designed to distribute its enormous weight more effectively. I watched until it disappeared behind a ridge, then sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I finally managed to grab my radio with shaking hands, I called Rich. "Rich!" My voice came out as a whisper at first, and I had to clear my throat and try again. "Rich, I saw it. I actually saw it." There was static, then his voice. "Saw what, Ron? Are you okay?" The thing that made those tracks, it was right here, right in front of me. Jesus, Rich, it was real. I must have sounded half crazy because Rich told me to stay put and that he'd come to me. I gave him my coordinates, then sat back down, still staring at the spot where the creature had stood. By the time Rich reached me, I'd calmed down enough to give him a coherent description of what I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. "Did it make any sounds besides the sneeze?" he asked. "Just the footsteps. They were heavy, like someone wearing work boots, but quieter than you'd expect for something that size." Rich was particularly interested in the creature's casual demeanor. "It just walked away? Didn't run?" "Yeah, like it wasn't concerned about me at all. We spent the next hour searching the area for physical evidence. We found a few partial prints similar to the ones we'd discovered earlier, but nothing clear enough for a cast. There were also some broken branches on a Joshua tree about 7 feet up, which would have been at shoulder height for the creature I saw. As the sun started to set, we reluctantly headed back to the truck. Rich was quiet for most of the drive, processing everything I'd told him. Finally, as we were approaching Palmdale, he said something that sent chills down my spine. "You know, the description you gave matches what Kim MacDonald reported almost exactly. Same height, same build, same dark hair with lighter patches." "You think it was the same one?" I asked. "Hard to say for sure, but given the proximity and the timing, it's possible." When we got back to the CBFO office, Rich had me document everything while it was still fresh. We spent hours going over every detail, comparing notes with Kim's account and looking at the few photographs we'd managed to take of the tracks. The organization took my sighting seriously, more seriously than I expected. They sent additional teams to the area over the next few days, but nothing else was found. Whatever I'd seen had moved on. It's been months now, and I still don't know what to make of what happened. I've gone back to that spot several times, always with other people, but there's been no sign of the creature. I catch myself looking for it whenever I'm outdoors now. I find myself studying the tree line when I drive, half expecting to see that tall figure watching from the shadows. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows hard against my house, it sounds like those heavy footsteps I heard in the desert. The weirdest thing is how it's changed my perception of the world. Before, I was just doing a job, humoring people who believed in things I didn't. Now I'm one of those people. I've seen something that shouldn't exist, according to conventional science. Yet there it was, clear as day, casually sneezing like it had a cold. I don't know what it was. Some undiscovered primate, a relic hominid that somehow survived alongside us for millennia, or something else entirely. I just know that it was real. It was massive, and for a brief moment we acknowledged each other's existence before it calmly walked away. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, walking with that same unhurried confidence through the desert. And sometimes, especially when I'm alone at night, I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 9. I've worked as a mountain guide in Kennedy Meadows for nearly 15 years now. For those who don't know, it's a remote spot west of China Lake in the Sequoia Mountains, California. Beautiful country, but isolated as hell. I run a supply operation with a train of mules and horses, carrying gear over the Sierra Nevada mountains to the Levining Bishop area. Been doing it so long that nothing much surprises me anymore. Mountain lions, black bears, harsh weather. I've seen it all and know how to handle myself. Or at least I thought I did until that night 3 months ago. I'm still not sure I should be writing this down, but I need to get it off my chest. I haven't told many people the full details because, honestly, who'd believe me? Plus, part of me is scared that talking about it might somehow bring it back. Stupid, I know, but that's where my head's at these days. It was early October, weather starting to turn, but still decent enough for running supplies. I'd just returned from a 5-day trek, and my animals were resting up in the corral I built myself years back. 8-foot fence made of telephone poles, sturdiest damn thing in the area and practically fortress-like. Nothing gets in or out without me knowing about it. At least that's what I always believed. I live about 100 yards from the corral in a small cabin. Nothing fancy, just the basics. After a long trip, I was beat, so I turned in early that night. Around 9 p.m. Must have been close to midnight when I woke up to a sound that still haunts me. The horses were going absolutely nuts. Not your normal snorting or stomping. This was pure animal terror, frantic whinnying, the thunder of hooves against dirt, the desperate sound of animals in complete panic. I've worked with horses my whole life and never heard anything like it. My first thought was mountain lion. We get them around here, and they sometimes spook the animals by prowling near the fence. Or maybe a black bear. They've been more common lately with the drought pushing them closer to human settlements looking for food. I grabbed my rifle, pulled on my boots, and threw on a jacket over my t-shirt and sweats. Didn't even bother with the flashlight at first. The moon was nearly full that night, and I know the path to the corral like the back of my hand. As I got closer, the sounds got worse. Pure chaos. Then I heard a different sound mixed in with the panic, something like wood cracking. I thought maybe one of the animals was throwing itself against the fence, trying to break out. When I reached the edge of the clearing where the corral stands, everything suddenly went silent. Not gradually quiet, I mean instant silence, like someone hit a mute button. Just the sound of the wind in the pines and my own breathing. That silence scared me more than the noise had. I raised my rifle and switched on my flashlight. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw in that beam of light. 6 of my animals, 4 horses and 2 mules, lay scattered across the corral. Dead. Just dead. I stood frozen for a good 30 seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The surviving animals were huddled in the farthest corner, trembling and pressed against each other. Instinct kicked in, and I scanned the perimeter, rifle ready. Nothing moved, no sign of anything. I approached the fence cautiously, checking for breaks or signs of something climbing over. Nothing. The gate was still secured with the same chain and padlock I'd used earlier that day. After making sure there was nothing hiding nearby, I entered the corral. The smell hit me first. Not just the normal animal smells, but something else. Something... I don't know how to describe it. Musty and wild, but not like any animal I know. Almost like wet fur mixed with something rotten, but not quite. I checked each animal, starting with Buddy, my oldest pack horse. 15 years I'd had him. No visible wounds or blood, no signs of struggle beyond what you'd expect from frightened animals trampling around. No bite marks, no claw marks, nothing that would tell me what killed them. I'm not ashamed to say my hands were shaking. I've field-dressed game my whole life, seen plenty of animal deaths, but this was different. Predators kill to eat, or at least there's blood, signs of a fight. This was wrong. The surviving animals wouldn't come near me. Another bad sign. These were well-trained pack animals that knew and trusted me, but now they looked at me like I was a stranger, eyes rolling white with fear. I checked the fence again, this time more thoroughly. Not a single post disturbed, no digging under it. The only way in was through the gate, which I'd secured myself. I spent the next hour going over everything with my flashlight, looking for any clue. Nothing made sense. My mind kept racing through possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. Mountain lion? No way it could kill 6 large animals without leaving a mark. Bear? Same problem, plus no way it could get in and out without a trace. The strangest thing, and this detail has kept me up nearly every night since, was the positions of the dead animals. They weren't clustered together like they'd been cornered. They were spread out across the corral, like each one had been taken down individually, efficiently, in different spots. Almost methodical. As the initial shock wore off, I realized I needed to document this. I took photos with my phone, though my hands were shaking so bad, half of them came out blurry. Then I called the local ranger station and left a message. It was nearly 2 a.m. by then. While waiting for dawn, I sat on the fence with my rifle, watching over the surviving animals. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the cabin, not with whatever had done this potentially still around. The hours crawled by. I've spent countless nights in the wilderness, but never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Every cracking twig, every rustle of wind through the trees had me swinging my flashlight around, heart pounding. At first light, I did another inspection. Daylight only made it more disturbing. 6 healthy animals dead without a mark. The corral undisturbed. No tracks, except those of my own animals. Later that morning, a ranger named Mike showed up. Good guy. Experienced in the backcountry, he was just as baffled as I was. He took his own photos, wrote up a report, and suggested I call a vet to determine cause of death. The vet came out that afternoon, Dr. Sanderson from Bishop. After examining all 6 carcasses, she was stumped too. No obvious trauma, no signs of poison. She took samples for testing and promised to call with results. I spent that day burying my animals. Hardest day's work I've ever done, digging those graves, saying goodbye to creatures I'd worked with for years. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the tree line. That evening, Joe Franklin, from about 5 miles down the road, came over. He'd heard about what happened from the ranger. As we sat on my porch with coffee, wished it was whiskey, but I needed to stay alert, he told me something that made my blood run cold. 2 nights before my incident, his dogs had been going crazy, barking like mad. He said they were throwing themselves against the side of his house, scratching to get in, which was weird because they were outdoor dogs that never wanted inside. He thought maybe they'd treat a raccoon or something. Then, like with my animals, everything suddenly went silent. Too silent. When Joe went out to check, he found all 3 of his dogs dead. No blood, no signs of what killed them, just dead, laid out in his yard. The thing that haunts him most. The way they were positioned, he's convinced they'd been grabbed by their back legs and slammed against the house until they stopped barking. He found marks on the siding that matched that theory. We sat there in silence for a while after he told me that. What the hell could kill that way? Nothing natural, that's for sure. The vet called a week later with the results. Inconclusive. No toxins, no disease, no obvious trauma. The only abnormality was some bruising around the chest cavities, like the animals had been subjected to extreme pressure. She suggested maybe they'd been frightened to death, their hearts giving out from terror. But 6 of them? All at once? No way. Since then, I've heard whispers around Kennedy Meadows. Some locals think it might have been a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, believe me. I've always scoffed at those stories. But after what I saw, what Joe experienced, I don't know anymore. There haven't been grizzlies in the Sierras for a century. Black bears don't kill like this. Mountain lions take one animal and drag it off to eat. Nothing we know about attacks without leaving a trace. Kills without feeding and can bypass a secured 8-foot fence. I've reinforced my corral with additional posts, installed motion sensor lights. I sleep with my rifle closer than my pillow, but I can't shake the feeling that if this thing wanted in again, none of that would matter. The surviving animals haven't been the same since. Jumpy, nervous, refusing to go near the spots where the others died. I've had to retire 2 of them from pack service because they're too traumatized to work reliably anymore. 3 months have passed. No similar incidents reported in the area. Maybe whatever it was moved on. Maybe it was just passing through. I hope to God that's the case. But sometimes, when I'm out on the trail with my animals, I catch them all looking in the same direction, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring, refusing to move. And even though I never see or hear anything, I know something's there, watching us from the trees. I don't lead treks alone anymore, always with at least one other guide. And we never stay in Kennedy Meadows more than 1 night. Whatever killed my animals that night is still out there. And the most terrifying part is that I'm not sure it's done yet. Story 10. Mesin, I still wake up in cold sweat sometimes, my heart pounding like it's trying to break through my chest. It's been over 40 years since that day near Bishop. But time hasn't dulled what I saw, or rather, what I almost saw and what they told me. Writing this down might help me process it. I don't know. All I know is I can't talk to anyone about it without them thinking I'm crazy, and I need to get this off my chest before I take it to my grave. This happened back in 1977, autumn time. I was an avid hunter back then, still am, though I stick to more populated areas these days. I had gotten special permission to hunt on this locked parcel of land about 30 miles outside Bishop, California. Beautiful country up there in the eastern Sierra, remote, pristine, the kind of place where you could really disconnect from everything. The Forest Service ranger who gave me permission was a drinking buddy, nothing official, just a handshake deal. "Just don't tell anyone I let you in there," he'd said, tossing me the key to the gate. "And bring me back some venison." I'd been to this area they called 4 Points a couple times before. It was named for the way 4 ridgelines intersected, creating this natural bowl that was perfect for deer habitat. You had to really want to get there. Rough terrain, no marked trails, just the kind of remote spot serious hunters dream about. The land was technically Bureau of Land Management property, but it butted up against National Forest land, creating this jurisdictional grey area that nobody seemed too concerned about policing. That morning started like any other hunting trip. I loaded up my Ford F-150, packed my Winchester 30-06, some jerky, water and my field dressing kit. Left my house around 4 a.m. to get to the gate by sunrise. The drive up was peaceful, just me, my thermos of coffee, and Merle Haggard on the 8-track. I remember thinking how perfect the day was going to be. Clear skies, crisp mountain air, not too cold. When I reached the gate, something felt off right away. The heavy padlock was hanging open, which was unusual. This was supposed to be restricted land. I figured maybe another Forest Service guy had been through recently and forgotten to secure it. I swung the gate open, drove through, then got out and closed it behind me, didn't lock it since it was already compromised. The dirt road leading to 4 Points was about 7 miles of switchbacks and rough terrain. My truck handled it fine. I had the 4-wheel drive engaged the whole way. As I rounded the final bend that opened into the bowl-shaped clearing, my stomach dropped. There were vehicles everywhere. Not just any vehicles, government rigs. I counted at least 8 white Department of Interior SUVs and a couple of larger trucks. Men in BLM uniforms were moving around purposefully, and they were armed, not just sidearms, but rifles, military-grade stuff that seemed excessive even for federal agents. I should have turned around right then. Something in my gut was screaming at me to back out slowly and pretend I'd never been there, but curiosity got the better of me. I figured maybe there was some kind of poaching operation they were cracking down on, or maybe drug smugglers using the remote area. Either way, I had permission to be there, so I kept driving. As soon as my truck became visible to the group, everything changed. 2 agents spotted me and immediately raised their rifles. Not pointed directly at me, but definitely in a ready position. Then a man in what looked like tactical gear started approaching my truck, hand on his holstered sidearm. "Kill the engine and step out slowly," he called as I rolled to a stop. My heart was hammering, but I did as I was told. As soon as my boots hit the dirt, 2 more agents flanked me, and the first guy, tall, crew-cut, mirrored sunglasses despite the tree cover, asked for identification. "What's going on here?" I asked, handing over my driver's license. "I have permission to hunt this area." "Permission from who?" the agent demanded. When I told him about my Forest Service buddy, his face hardened. He exchanged looks with one of the other men, then turned back to me. "What's in the truck?" "Just my hunting gear, rifle, cooler, the usual stuff." That's when things got really weird. They had me stand back while they searched my vehicle. One of them removed my rifle, unloaded it, and handed it to the leader. "You're coming with us," the leader said, not returning my Winchester. "We need to ask you some questions." They escorted me to what appeared to be a makeshift command center, a large canvas tent set up at the far end of the clearing. As we walked, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The campground area, a simple setup with a few picnic tables and fire rings, was completely destroyed. Not just messy or vandalized, but destroyed. One of the concrete anchored tables was upended and cracked in half. The steel trash containers, those heavy-duty bear-proof ones that weigh at least 200 pounds, were crushed and tossed around like toys. It looked like a tornado had touched down in just that one spot. Inside the tent, they sat me down at a folding table. The interrogation that followed lasted 7 hours. 7 hours of the same questions over and over, asked by different people, sometimes simultaneously. Who was I? Why was I there? Had I been there the day before? Had I seen anything unusual in the area? Did I tell anyone where I was going? The questions were relentless, but I still had no idea what had happened. Around hour 3, they brought in what I assume was some kind of senior official, older guy, grey at the temples, wearing a button-up shirt instead of the tactical gear the others had on. He sat across from me and studied my face for an uncomfortable amount of time before speaking. "Mr. Johnson," he said, using my last name for the first time since they'd taken my ID, "understand that this is a matter of national security. Whatever you see or hear today doesn't leave this mountain. Are we clear?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "Now, I need to know, and this is important. Have you ever encountered anything unusual in these woods? Anything that didn't seem natural?" The question threw me. "Like what?" I asked. "Large wildlife. Specifically, anything bipedal that shouldn't be." My mind immediately went to bear sightings, but the way he emphasized bipedal sent a chill down my spine. "No, sir," I answered honestly. "Just deer, some coyotes, the usual." He exchanged glances with one of the other agents before continuing. "Yesterday afternoon, something went through this area. Something big. It destroyed the campground, as you probably noticed on your way in. It also—" He paused, seemingly choosing his words carefully. "There were people here. Campers. They encountered whatever it was." The room went quiet. I waited for him to continue, but he just stared at me expectantly. "I don't understand," I finally said. "What happened to them?" Another agent behind him shifted uncomfortably. The senior official leaned forward. "They're dead, Mr. Johnson. All of them. In a manner that I cannot and will not describe to you other than to say it was gruesome, and no ordinary animal could have done it." My stomach lurched. "A bear attack," I suggested weakly. The man actually laughed, a short, humorless sound. "No, not a bear. The evidence suggests something much larger. Prints indicate a bipedal creature, approximately 8 to 9 feet tall, estimated weight over 800 pounds. I felt like I was in some kind of bizarre dream. "What are you saying, like a Sasquatch or something?" The word felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth in that serious setting. No one laughed this time. The senior official's face remained impassive. "I'm not at liberty to speculate on what it might have been. What I can tell you is that whatever did this displayed strength far beyond human capability. Those trash containers that were thrown, each weighs nearly 300 pounds when empty. They were tossed over 50 yards. My mind was reeling. "How many?" I asked quietly. "How many what?" "People. How many people died?" He hesitated, then said, 5 that we know of. 2 families. 1 child. I remember feeling physically ill at that point. The thought of a child being killed, and in some gruesome way they wouldn't even describe, made me want to run from that tent and never look back. The questioning continued. They wanted to know if I'd heard any rumors about strange creatures in the area, if I'd noticed any unusual animal behavior patterns, if I'd ever felt watched while hunting. They asked if I'd ever found inexplicable tree structures or smelled anything unusual, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat, was how one agent described it. By hour 5, I was exhausted and increasingly frightened, not just by what they were implying had happened, but by the intensity of their interest in me. They treated me like I was hiding something crucial. One agent even suggested I might have been sent to monitor their response. It wasn't until nearly dusk that I got a break. My Forest Service buddies showed up. They'd tracked him down to verify my story. I've never been so relieved to see anyone in my life. He vouched for me, confirmed he'd given me permission to hunt there, and things finally started to de-escalate. The senior official made me sign some papers, non-disclosure agreements they called them, before they would release me. The language was severe, threatening everything from imprisonment to financial ruin if I ever spoke about what I'd seen or heard that day. "You understand that this incident never happened," the official said as I signed the last page. "There was no campground destruction. There were no deaths. There was a training exercise, nothing more. They gave me back my truck keys, but kept my rifle. For ballistic testing, they claimed, though I suspected it was just to ensure I couldn't stay in the area." As a parting message, the senior official made it crystal clear. You are never to return to this location. Your hunting permission is permanently revoked. If you're found in this area again, you will be arrested without question or explanation. My Forest Service buddy walked me to my truck. He looked shaken. What the hell happened here? I whispered as we got out of earshot of the others. He glanced around nervously. Listen, don't ask questions. These guys aren't messing around. I shouldn't tell you this, but there's talk among the local rangers. Something big went through here yesterday. Really big. He lowered his voice even further. The campers they found. They weren't just killed. They were torn apart, Jim. Like something was rage-filled, not just hungry. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening. You're saying it was really a... Don't, he cut me off. Don't even say it. Just go home and forget about this place. I drove down that mountain in a daze, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking about what could possibly be strong enough to flip those heavy steel containers, to destroy concrete-anchored picnic tables, to tear apart human beings. When I got home, I sat in my dark kitchen until sunrise, unable to sleep, unable to process what I'd learned. The next day, I called in sick to work. Then the next day too. For weeks after, I had nightmares about being watched by something huge hiding just beyond the tree line. I never went back to 4 Points, never asked for my rifle back either, seemed safer to just let it go. My Forest Service buddy transferred to a district in Oregon a month later. We never spoke about that day again. Years passed, and I tried to convince myself it had been some kind of bizarre government exercise or maybe a mountain lion attack they were covering up for tourism reasons. But deep down, I knew. The fear in those agents' eyes wasn't procedural. They'd seen something that terrified them, something they couldn't explain or control. I've kept this secret for over 40 years now. I heard rumors that a few local cops in Bishop knew about it. Apparently it was big talk among law enforcement for a while before they shut it down, but officially nothing ever happened at 4 Points that day in autumn 1977. No campground was destroyed, no families were killed, and there certainly wasn't an 8-foot-tall creature roaming the eastern Sierra that could tear a human being apart with its bare hands. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what they saw, something that made hardened government agents pale with fear, something they were willing to cover up at all costs. Sometimes when I'm out in the woods now, even in populated areas with other hunters around, I get this feeling like I'm being watched, like something is evaluating me from just beyond my field of vision. And I wonder if whatever was at 4 Points that day is still out there, moving silently through the wilderness, watching and waiting. I'll never know what really happened to those families, their names, their stories, all erased as if they never existed. But I carry the weight of their untold tragedy and the knowledge that something beyond explanation stalks the remote corners of our world, and that's a burden I'll carry to my grave. Story 11. I've been putting off writing about this for over 50 years now. Some experiences stay with you, gnawing at the back of your mind, no matter how hard you try to forget them. What happened that day in July 1971 completely changed my understanding of the wilderness I thought I knew. I'd been with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department for almost 20 years by then. I'd seen just about everything you could imagine, domestic disputes, armed robberies, you name it. Nothing really surprised me anymore, at least that's what I thought until we got those reports about an upright walking bear in the mountains near Newhall. The calls started coming in early July. At first, I dismissed them as the usual summer nonsense. People camping, having a few too many beers, letting their imaginations run wild in the dark. But then the descriptions started getting consistent, extremely tall, walking on 2 legs, moving with incredible speed through difficult terrain. And these weren't just random campers. We had reports from a forest ranger, a geology professor, and several experienced hunters. After the 5th call in 3 days, I knew I had to check it out. I contacted Rich Grumley from the California Bigfoot organization. I'd worked with Rich before on a couple of unusual cases, and while I wasn't sold on the whole Bigfoot thing, I respected his methodical approach. He agreed to meet me, along with 2 other CBO members the following morning, at the ranger station near Newhall, July 17th. That date is burned into my memory. I remember it was unusually hot, even for Southern California in July. I arrived at the station around 6 a.m., wanting to get an early start before the worst of the heat set in. Rich was already there with his team, a wildlife biologist named Mark, and a tracker called Dave, who'd worked with search and rescue teams for years. We gathered our equipment: cameras, plaster casting materials, measuring tape, topographical maps of the area. Rich had brought along recordings of supposed Bigfoot calls, though I thought that was a bit much. Dave carefully checked his tracking kit, and I made sure my service revolver was secure. I wasn't expecting trouble, but 20 years on the force teaches you to be prepared. The ranger on duty pointed us toward the most recent sighting areas. Most reports clustered around a remote section of forest, about 8 miles from the nearest road. We loaded up my department Bronco and one of Rich's Jeeps and headed out. The drive took about an hour on increasingly rough Forest Service roads. The whole way, Rich played recordings of witness interviews. The descriptions were remarkably similar. An enormous, dark figure, moving with surprising speed through dense brush, always upright. Several mentioned unusual silence, no birds or small animals making noise when the creature was present. We parked where the road ended and continued on foot. The plan was to establish a base camp and then split into 2 teams to cover more ground. Rich and Mark would head north toward a ridgeline where several sightings had occurred. Dave and I would investigate an area near a creek where unusual tracks had been reported. I remember checking my watch as we separated, 8:32 a.m. I had this habit from police work, always noting the exact time when beginning an investigation. Dave nodded toward a game trail that followed the creek, and we set off. The morning passed uneventfully. We found some interesting tracks, but nothing conclusive, mostly deer, some coyote. Dave was good, pointing out things I would have missed entirely. The heat was building, and by noon the temperature must have hit 95 degrees. We stopped in a shaded area by the creek to eat the sandwiches we'd packed. "You don't really believe in this stuff, do you?" I remember asking Dave as we rested. He took a long drink from his canteen before answering. "I've been tracking animals and people in wilderness areas for 17 years, tracked lost hikers, fugitives, you name it. I've seen things I can't explain. I'm not saying it's Bigfoot, but there's something out here that doesn't fit the known wildlife patterns." After lunch, we continued along the creek for another mile or so. The terrain was getting rougher, with the creek cutting through a narrow canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, creating deep shadows despite the midday sun. The temperature dropped noticeably as we entered the canyon. That's when Dave froze. He held up his hand in the universal signal to stop, then pointed to the ground about 20 feet ahead of us. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just some disturbed earth near the water's edge. But as we approached, I realized what had caught his attention. A footprint. A massive footprint pressed into the damp soil. I've seen bear tracks plenty of times. This wasn't a bear. It was clearly a foot, with 5 toes, a distinct heel, and a mid-foot arch. But the size... I pulled out my tape measure. 17 inches long. I've got big feet, wear a size 12 boot, and this print dwarfed mine by almost double. Dave was already examining the ground around it, moving in widening circles. "Here's another," he called softly from about 7 feet away. Then another beyond that. We followed the tracks as they crossed the creek and continued up the steep canyon wall. The spacing between prints was what really got to me. I carefully measured the distance between consecutive footprints, 84 inches. That's a 7-foot stride. For comparison, I'm 6.2, and my normal walking stride is about 30 inches. Even when I stretch to my maximum step, I can barely manage 50 inches. Whatever made these tracks could cover ground at an incredible rate. We followed the tracks up the canyon wall. The terrain was extremely difficult. Loose rock, dense brush, steep inclines. Yet the tracks showed no signs of stumbling or slipping. Whatever left them navigated this difficult landscape with ease. "Should we try to catch up to Rich and Mark?" Dave asked, his voice unusually tight. I shook my head. "Let's follow these as far as we can first. Document everything." I took photos of each print with my department-issued camera, using a ruler in the frame for scale. Dave made plaster casts of the clearest prints. We worked our way up the hillside, following this impossible trail. The tracks led us about 2 miles up and over a ridge I hadn't planned to cross. According to our maps, we were heading toward 9 Mile Canyon, west of China Lake. The prints never faltered, maintaining that incredible 7-foot stride even on the steepest sections. It was around 3 p.m. when the atmosphere changed. I can't describe it any other way. The air felt different, heavier somehow. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals, just stopped. Complete silence except for our own breathing and the crunch of our boots on the ground. Dave felt it too. I could tell by the way his head suddenly snapped up, the way his eyes scanned the trees around us. He was an experienced outdoorsman, and something had triggered his awareness. "Do you smell that?" he whispered. I hadn't noticed it until he mentioned it, but yes, there was an odor. Not the usual forest smells of pine and earth, but something musky and organic. It reminded me of the time I'd helped transport a circus elephant as part of a police escort. That distinct, heavy animal smell, but wilder. We continued following the tracks, moving more cautiously now. The silence was oppressive. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, feeling like we were being watched. 20 years in law enforcement gives you a sixth sense for danger, and every instinct I had was now screaming at me. The tracks led us to the edge of a small clearing. On the far side, about 100 yards away, the tree line resumed, darker and denser than the forest we'd been traversing. Something about that wall of trees made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Dave stopped so suddenly I nearly ran into him. He was staring intently at the tree line. I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual at first. Then I saw movement, just a shift in the shadows really, but definitely movement. Something large was moving parallel to the clearing's edge, staying within the darkness of the trees. Whatever it was big enough to disturb branches at least 8 feet off the ground. "Camera," Dave whispered urgently. I fumbled with the department camera, trying to get it ready. The movement continued along the tree line, always staying just within the shadows. I raised the camera and snapped several photos, not sure if I was capturing anything useful. Then it stopped. The movement, the disturbance of branches, everything just stopped. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I knew somehow that whatever was in those trees was now looking directly at us. Dave and I stood frozen, neither of us willing to move or speak. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there staring at the dark tree line while something in those trees stared back at us. Then we heard it. A deep, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a breath, something in between. It was so low I felt it more than heard it, like standing near a large bass speaker. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when we saw it step partially out of the tree line. I still struggled to describe what I saw. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Broad shoulders, covered in dark hair or fur. It stood completely upright in a human posture, but there was nothing human about its proportions. The creature took one step forward into slightly better light. I raised my camera automatically and took another photo. The sound of the shutter seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The thing reacted to the camera sound. Its head, massive and somehow both ape-like and not, turned directly toward me. I couldn't make out details of its face, but I could feel its gaze lock onto me with an intelligence that froze the blood in my veins. For 3 seconds, I counted them in my head, a habit from firearms training. We stared at each other across that clearing. 3 seconds that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Then it made that sound again, that deep vibrating rumble, and stepped backward into the trees. The foliage moved, branches swayed, and it was gone. The speed with which it disappeared was perhaps the most unnerving part. One moment it was there, a massive presence at the edge of the clearing, and the next it had vanished into the forest without a sound. Dave and I stood there for several minutes, neither of us speaking or moving. Finally, he turned to me, his face pale beneath his tan. "We should go back," he said quietly. "Now." I nodded, suddenly aware that the sun was lower than I'd realized. We had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, and I had no desire to be in these woods after dark. We carefully backed away from the clearing, keeping our eyes on the tree line. Only when we were back among the trees on our side did we turn and begin making our way back toward the creek. The return journey was tense. We moved as quickly as possible, constantly scanning our surroundings. The forest remained unnaturally quiet. Twice we stopped because we thought we heard something moving parallel to our path, but we saw nothing. We reached the creek as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the canyon. The base camp was still a good hour's hike away. Dave suggested we use our flashlights, but something made me hesitate. Some primal instinct told me that announcing our presence with lights was a bad idea. We continued in the gathering darkness, moving as quietly as possible. About halfway back to camp, Dave grabbed my arm and pulled me to a stop. He didn't speak, just pointed to a ridge about 50 yards to our right. Silhouetted against the darkening sky was a large, upright figure. It stood motionless, watching us from the ridgeline. Even at that distance, I could tell it was the same creature we'd seen earlier. It was following us. We stood frozen, watching each other across the distance. Then, with deliberate slowness, the figure turned and disappeared over the ridge. We practically ran the rest of the way back to camp. Rich and Mark were already there, looking worried. They'd been about to organize a search party for us. When we told them what we'd seen and showed them the photos and plaster casts, Rich became extremely excited. Mark looked skeptical until he measured the casts himself and calculated the stride length. "This isn't possible," he kept saying. "Nothing this size can exist without being documented." But the evidence was right there in front of us. 17-inch footprints, an 84-inch stride, photos that showed, well, not as much as I'd hoped. When we developed them later, most showed just shadows and blurry movement. Only one captured a partial figure, and even that could be disputed by skeptics. We packed up camp that night and left at first light the next morning. I filed a report with the department, including all our evidence. The official response was predictable, interesting, but inconclusive. Probably a bear, misidentified due to unusual lighting conditions. But I know what I saw. I've questioned witnesses for 20 years, separated truth from lies, facts from imagination. What I saw that day in those mountains wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything known to science. I've gone back several times over the years, sometimes with Rich and his team, sometimes alone. I've never seen the creature again, though I've found similar tracks twice more in the same general area. The photos from that day are stored in a safe deposit box now. The plaster casts sit on my bookshelf. Sometimes I take them out and measure them again, as if the numbers might have changed, as if 17 inches might somehow become more reasonable with time. They haven't. Neither has the memory of those 3 seconds when I looked directly at something that shouldn't exist, something that looked back at me with undeniable intelligence. I don't talk about this much anymore. People either believe without questioning or dismiss without considering. But it happened, July 17th, 1971. The day I realized how little we truly know about the wilderness we think we've conquered. Story 12. I've been hesitant to share this for years. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Honestly, I'm not sure I'd believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it. But what happened to me in the Sam Houston National Forest back in 2014 still gives me nightmares, and I need to get it off my chest. I'm a researcher focusing on cryptozoology and unusual animal behaviors. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but I've spent my entire adult life in the field, and I've always approached my work with scientific skepticism, or at least I did, until that night in Piney Woods. I'd heard stories about the area for years. Locals talked about strange sounds, massive footprints, and shadowy figures moving through the trees. Most researchers in my field had written off Piney Woods as just another hotspot for overactive imaginations, but the consistency of the reports intrigued me. I'd been there twice before with mixed experiences, but nothing prepared me for what happened during my third visit. I convinced Bob Garrett, a local guide who knew the forest better than anyone, to take me deep into the area. Bob brought 2 of his crew members, experienced outdoorsmen who'd spent their lives in these woods. I felt safer with them around, especially since my previous trips had left me uneasy. We arrived around mid-afternoon and set up camp in a small clearing. The forest was unusually quiet that day. No birds, no squirrels chattering, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Bob mentioned it seemed too damn quiet, but I brushed it off as normal forest variations. As evening approached, we finished setting up our tents and gear. We had a small fire going, just enough to cook dinner and provide some light. The guys were telling hunting stories while I set up my audio recording equipment around the perimeter of our camp. I'd been collecting ambient forest sounds for years, comparing them with alleged Sasquatch vocalizations. Round 8:30 p.m., the sun had fully set and darkness enveloped the forest. We sat around the fire, keeping our voices low. I'd always found that staying quiet increases the chances of wildlife approaching. Bob had his rifle leaning against the log he was sitting on, standard practice for him in the backcountry. That's when I first felt it. A sensation of being watched that was so intense it made the hair on my arms stand up. I've spent hundreds of nights in forests across North America, and I've never felt anything like it before. It wasn't just the feeling of an animal's curious eyes. This felt deliberate, intelligent, and somehow angry. I whispered to Bob, asking if he felt it too. He nodded slowly, his hand casually moving closer to his rifle. One of his crew members, I think his name was Mike, whispered, "Something's out there. Something big." We sat in tense silence for maybe 5 minutes. Then we heard it, crashing sounds in the brush about 150 yards from camp. Not the sound of a deer or hog moving through undergrowth, but heavy, deliberate movement. Branches breaking, vegetation being pushed aside with force. "Probably just a black bear," I said, not believing it myself. Black bears in East Texas don't typically make that much noise, and they generally avoid humans. Bob shook his head. "Ain't no bear," he muttered. The crashing stopped suddenly. Complete silence fell over the forest again. Even the insects seemed to go quiet, which is never a good sign. I stood up, thinking maybe one of the other crew members had wandered off and was making their way back to camp. "Hey, is that you, Chris?" I called out, not too loudly. That's when it happened. From the exact spot where we'd heard the crashing, someone, let out a sound that froze my blood. It wasn't a howl exactly, and it wasn't a scream. It was something in between, with a guttural quality that no human could produce. The closest I can describe it is like a monkey trying to mimic an owl, but deeper, more powerful, like a freaking werewolf from the movies, but this was real life. Before I could even process what I'd heard, there was movement at the edge of the darkness. Something massive was charging directly at our camp. All I could make out was a large, dark shape moving with incredible speed. Whatever it was covered about 150 yards in seconds, faster than any human could run, especially through dense forest at night. I stumbled backward, falling over the log I'd been sitting on. Bob jumped to his feet, grabbing his rifle. The two crew members were frozen in place, their faces pale in the firelight. The shape stopped just at the edge of our camp's light, still partially obscured by trees. For a split second, I saw its outline. At least 7 feet tall, broad-shouldered, covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. And then it was gone, retreating back into the darkness with the same impossible speed. "What the fuck was that?" one of the crew members whispered, his voice shaking. Bob had his rifle up now, scanning the tree line. "Wes, get the flashlights," he said calmly, though I could hear tension in his voice. My hands trembling, I dug through my backpack and pulled out my heavy-duty maglite. Bob had already grabbed his own flashlight. "Stay here," he told his crew. "Keep the fire going." I should have stayed too. Everything in my body was screaming at me to stay by the fire, but my researcher's curiosity overrode my fear. I followed Bob as he moved cautiously toward where we'd seen the figure retreat. We got about 50 feet from camp when both of us stopped simultaneously. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I swung my flashlight in a slow arc, the beam cutting through the darkness between the trees. Nothing. "It's right there," Bob whispered, nodding toward a dense stand of pines about 30-40 feet ahead of us. "I can feel it watching us." I pointed my flashlight in that direction, but saw nothing but trees and underbrush. Still, I knew Bob was right. Whatever had charged our camp was there, just out of sight, observing us. We took a few steps forward, and that's when I heard the strangest sound, like helicopter blades whooshing through the air. Before I could react, something massive flew past my head, missing me by inches. It struck a tree in front of us with such force that the trunk cracked. A log, something had thrown a log at us. Not a stick or a branch, but a section of tree trunk at least 4 feet long and 8 inches in diameter. It would have taken 2 strong men to even lift it, let alone throw it with such velocity. "Get back to camp!" Bob shouted, all pretense of calm gone from his voice. We turned and ran, the sound of our panicked breathing and footsteps seeming impossibly loud in the quiet forest. As we reached the campfire, I realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't my first experience with logs being thrown in piney woods. During my previous visit, something had hurled a similar-sized log directly at where my girlfriend had been sitting just moments before. On another occasion, I'd had to take shelter in my truck as it was bombarded with rocks and sticks for nearly an hour. When I finally emerged, my campsite had been completely ransacked, tent torn apart, supplies scattered everywhere. I told this to Bob as we rejoined his crew, who were now visibly terrified. "It's the same pattern," I said. "It's trying to drive us out." "Well, it's doing a damn good job," one of the crew members muttered. Bob was scanning the darkness beyond our camp, his rifle at the ready. "We need to pack up. Now." We quickly began gathering our essential gear, planning to hike back to the trail junction where we'd left our vehicles. That's when the assault began in earnest. Tree limbs started flying into our camp from all directions. Not small branches, but substantial limbs that could cause serious injury. They were followed by what sounded like entire small trees being snapped and thrown. One crashed down just feet from where I was standing, sending me scrambling backward. The sounds accompanied the attack, those same owl-monkey vocalizations, but now there seemed to be more than one source. They were communicating, coordinating their assault on our camp. "They're surrounding us!" Mike shouted, ducking as another branch sailed over his head. I was stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack when I heard a different sound, heavy footsteps circling our camp just beyond the firelight. Not one set, but multiple. Whatever these things were, they were moving with purpose, keeping to the shadows as they encircled us. The most terrifying moment came when one of them mimicked my voice. "Hey, is that you, Chris?" The exact words I'd called out earlier, but distorted, deeper, like someone playing a recording at the wrong speed. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt physically sick. Bob fired a warning shot into the air, which bought us about 30 seconds of silence. Then the assault intensified. Rocks joined the branches and logs, pelting our camp from all sides. One struck the side of my backpack as I was lifting it, the impact nearly knocking me over. "We need to go now!" Bob shouted. "Leave anything you haven't packed!" We formed a tight group, Bob leading with his rifle and flashlight, one of his crew taking the rear position. We moved as quickly as we could through the darkness, heading for the trail that would lead us back to civilization. The entire half-mile hike to our vehicles was accompanied by sounds of pursuit, heavy footsteps paralleling our path through the woods, those unnerving calls echoing around us, occasional crashes as more objects were hurled in our direction, though with less accuracy now that we were moving. When we finally reached our vehicles, I had never been so relieved to see my battered old Ford pickup. We threw our gear into the back and piled in, Bob and one crewman with me, the other taking his own truck. As I turned the key and the engine roared to life, I caught movement in my headlights just for a split second, a massive figure darting between trees at the edge of the clearing. Then it was gone. We drove out of there as fast as the rough forest roads would allow, not saying much. The shared experience hung between us like a physical presence. When we reached the main highway, Bob finally broke the silence. 8 years I've been guiding in these woods, he said quietly. Never seen anything like that, never want to again. I dropped Bob and his crewman off at their meeting point. Before getting out of my truck, Bob turned to me. "Wes, whatever those things were, they weren't just passing through. They were territorial, organized, and they recognized you from before." His words chilled me more than anything else that had happened that night, because I knew he was right. I drove straight through to Houston, stopping only for gas. Every time I closed my eyes for weeks afterward, I saw that dark shape charging our camp, heard that impossible voice mimicking my words. I haven't been back to Piney Woods since. My research has continued in other areas, but something changed in me that night. Science can't explain what we experienced, or at least not the science we currently understand. I still have the audio recordings from that night. Sometimes I listen to them, trying to convince myself there's a rational explanation for what we heard. But then those vocalizations start. Those impossible, chilling sounds, and I know better. Whatever lives in the Sam Houston National Forest isn't just an undiscovered primate or a misidentified bear. It's something far more intelligent, more deliberate, and it doesn't want us there. Story 13. I've never really told my story to anyone outside my immediate family. Hell, most of them think I made it up or had some kind of mental breakdown. But what happened to me in '65 was as real as the scars I still carry. I was 27 then, working at the lumber mill in Conroe. Had been hiking since I was a boy, so the trails around Sam Houston National Forest were like a second home to me. I knew every bend, every stream crossing on the popular routes. The Lone Star Trail was my weekend escape, a place to clear my head after long shifts at the mill. April 17th, 1965. The date is burned into my memory. The weather that morning was perfect, about 68 degrees, clear skies, just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. I packed light, canteen, couple sandwiches, my pocket knife, small first aid kit, planned to do the full 8-mile loop and be back before sunset. Started out around 9 a.m. The first couple hours were exactly what I needed. Peaceful, just me and the woods. Birds were active. Saw a couple deer in the distance. Nothing unusual. I stopped at the halfway point, this little rocky outcrop that overlooks Pine Creek, to eat one of my sandwiches. That's when things started to feel different. It's hard to explain the feeling, like when you're home alone and suddenly you're sure someone else is in the house. That kind of crawling awareness. At first I ignored it. Woods play tricks on your mind sometimes, and I'd hiked alone hundreds of times. About 20 minutes after I started walking again, I heard the first sound. Just a twig snap maybe 30 yards behind me. Didn't think much of it, probably a squirrel or armadillo. Then another snap, closer this time. Still, I figured it was just wildlife. But then the pattern became obvious. Every time I'd walk, I'd hear movement behind me. When I stopped, the sounds would stop. But only after a slight delay. Like whatever was making them was reacting to me. I'm not a jumpy person, but after about the 5th time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. "Hello?" I called out. No answer except birds going quiet. The rational part of my brain said it might be another hiker, maybe some kid playing a prank. But Lone Star wasn't heavily trafficked, especially on weekdays, and whatever was following me was moving oddly. Not on the trail itself, but parallel to it, in the thicker brush. The feeling of being watched intensified. Ever have the hair on the back of your neck stand up? It was like that, but across my entire body. I picked up my pace, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Then came the smell. It hit me suddenly, this powerful, musky odor, like wet dog combined with something rotting and something else I couldn't identify. So strong it made my eyes water. I'd been in the woods all my life and never smelled anything like it. Not a bear, not a skunk, nothing natural. I was approaching the densest part of the trail, a stretch where the pines grow so close together the midday sun barely penetrates. Most times I enjoyed that section, the way the temperature drops and everything gets quiet. That day, it felt like walking into a trap. About 50 yards into this section, I heard it. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from something massive. Not a bear growl. I'd heard those before. This was deeper, almost like it had human qualities, but distorted through something inhuman. The sound vibrated in my chest. That was the moment fear took over. I turned and started walking quickly in the opposite direction, not quite running yet, but moving with purpose. Whatever was out there, I wanted distance between us. Crack! The sound was deafening, like a cannon going off right next to me. A massive tree branch, easily thick as my thigh, crashed down on the trail, right where I would have been if I hadn't turned around. Not a dead branch either, but one that had been forcefully broken from about 20 feet up. I froze, staring at it. That branch would have crushed my skull, and there was no wind that day. None. That's when I started running. I abandoned the trail, crashing through underbrush, looking for the quickest way to open ground. There was a meadow about a quarter-mile ahead if I cut directly through the woods. My mind was racing. I needed to get somewhere I could see what was pursuing me. The sounds behind me changed. No more careful stalking. Whatever it was charging through the woods after me, breaking branches, heavy impacts on the ground that I could feel through my boots. Fast. Too fast for its size. I burst out of the tree line into the meadow, gasping for breath. For a split second, I felt relief at being in open space. Then I saw it. It was standing at the far edge of the meadow, directly in my path. God help me, I still see it when I close my eyes at night. 8 feet tall at least, covered in reddish-brown hair that hung in matted clumps. Not standing like a bear, but upright like a man. But it wasn't a man. The proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, shoulders impossibly broad. Its hands, if you could call them that, hung down past its knees. The face is what haunts me most. Not quite human, not quite animal. Deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, awareness. It knew exactly what it was doing. I skidded to a stop about 50 yards from it. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. This thing shouldn't exist. Couldn't exist. It took a step forward, then another, moving with this strange rolling gait, powerful and deliberate. I was frozen in place, unable to run, unable to even scream. When it was about 30 feet away, it stopped. drew itself up to its full height, seemed to grow even taller somehow. Then it leaned forward and roared. The sound was unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. Started low, almost subsonic. I felt it in my teeth, my bones, before I fully heard it. Then it built into something between a roar and a scream that seemed impossible for any living throat to produce. So loud it distorted my vision, made the air itself seem to vibrate. That's the last thing I clearly remember. What came next comes back in fragments, like a nightmare you can't quite recall. Running through unfamiliar parts of the forest, the sensation of being carried, cold water, pain, the creature's face impossibly close to mine, that smell overwhelming me. I regained full consciousness, lying half submerged in Pine Creek, over 4 miles from the meadow where I'd encountered the creature. The sun was setting. My clothes were soaked and torn. My body was covered in cuts and bruises I had no memory of receiving. One particularly deep gash on my forearm needed 17 stitches later. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there, no logical explanation for how I'd traveled that distance through dense forest in what appeared to be less than 2 hours. It should have been impossible, especially in my condition. When I finally stumbled out to the main road, a passing truck driver picked me up. Must have been quite a sight, soaking wet, clothes torn, wild-eyed and babbling. He thought I'd been attacked by a person, took me straight to the hospital in Conroe. The doctors found pine needles embedded deep in my skin, some requiring surgical removal. My boots were missing, never found them. Had a concussion they couldn't explain, since there was no corresponding wound on my head, and bruises around my midsection, like I'd been gripped by something with enormous strength. I told the sheriff what happened. He listened politely, wrote it all down, then suggested maybe I'd fallen, hit my head, and imagined the rest. That became the official explanation. Hiker gets lost, falls, suffers hallucinations due to concussion and exposure. But I know what I saw. And sometimes I still feel like it's watching me. The rangers searched the area but found nothing unusual. No giant footprints, no broken branches. No sign anything had been there at all, just a section of forest like any other. I never went back to Lone Star Trail. Quit my job at the mill a month later and moved to Oklahoma. Couldn't stand being near those woods anymore. For years afterward, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, that roar echoing in my head. Still do sometimes. Over the years, I've read about other sightings in East Texas. Some details match what I experienced. The smell, the sounds, the size makes me feel less crazy, but not less afraid. I've spent decades trying to understand what happened that day. How did I end up miles away with no memory of the journey? Did it carry me there? Why didn't it kill me when it clearly could have? Was it warning me away from something, protecting territory? Or was there some other purpose I can't comprehend? I'm an old man now. Don't have many years left, but I needed to put this down somewhere, tell someone what really happened, because whatever that thing was, it's still out there. And the most terrifying part is that we share this world with something that can remain hidden so completely despite its size and power. I still have nightmares about those eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They knew me, saw me, and sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet, I swear I can still hear that roar, like it's calling me back to the forest to finish whatever began that day in 1965. Story 14. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 15 years now. Honestly, I still get nightmares about what happened that day. This isn't some campfire story or something I made up for attention. I wish to God it was. This is about something that happened to me back in 2009 that completely changed how I see the woods, and frankly, my whole understanding of what's really out there. I'm a professional photographer, have been for most of my adult life. Back in the summer of 2009, I was on assignment for Texas Highways magazine to capture some nature shots in Sam Houston National Forest. Pretty standard gig. I'd done dozens like it before. The editor wanted some scenic shots, maybe some wildlife if I got lucky. Nothing complicated, just the kind of job I could do in my sleep. I remember that day was hot as hell, typical Texas summer. Must have been in the high 90s, and the humidity made it feel like you were walking through soup. I'd packed extra water bottles, some trail mix, my camera gear, and headed out early to get set up. I was working near Cold Spring, a beautiful area of the forest that I'd shot before. I hiked maybe a mile or two into the woods to find a good spot. Found this perfect little clearing that offered great sightlines and decent light filtering through the canopy. It was maybe 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and I figured I'd hang around until dusk to get those golden hour shots the magazine always loves. I'd set up my tripod, checked my lenses, and just settled in to wait. Wildlife photography is 90% patience, just sitting still and quiet until something decides to wander by. I was hoping for deer, maybe some birds, nothing too crazy. I had my Canon with the telephoto lens, my backup camera, and a few different lenses in my bag. After about an hour of waiting, I started hearing some rustling in the underbrush beyond the clearing. Nothing unusual. These woods are full of life. Could have been anything from squirrels to armadillos. But then I heard something bigger, branches breaking, the sound of something heavy moving through the trees. My first thought was deer, and I quietly readied my camera. But instead of a deer, a small black bear cub emerged at the edge of the clearing. It was maybe 50 yards away, just sniffing around at the tree line. I froze, trying not to spook it, and slowly raised my camera. The bear seemed oblivious to me, just poking around, doing bear cub things. I managed to snap a couple of quick shots, then the cub suddenly went still. It raised its nose, sniffed the air a few times, and then bolted, just turned tail and ran back into the forest like something had scared it half to death. That's when my heart sank. I'd been doing this long enough to know that where there's a bear cub, there's almost always a mama bear nearby, and mama bears aren't exactly known for their hospitality toward humans who get near their cubs. I immediately started packing up my gear. I wasn't about to stick around and end up as a statistic in some When Wildlife Attacks documentary. As I was collapsing my tripod, I had this weird feeling, that prickly sensation on the back of your neck when you're being watched. I paused and looked around the clearing. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, nothing. Anyone who's spent time in forests knows that's not normal. The woods are never completely silent unless something has spooked every living thing in the vicinity. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw it. About 10 or 12 feet away from me, partially hidden behind some thick brush, was a massive dark shape. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear standing on its hind legs. But no, this was way too big, too wrong. I'm 6'3", not a small guy by any means, but I had to crane my neck up at like a 20 or 30 degree angle just to see where this thing's head would be. The shoulders on this creature were enormous, easily twice as broad as mine, and I used to play college football. It was covered in dark, matted hair or fur. Not black exactly, more like a dark brown. For maybe 3 seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't see its face clearly through the brush, but I could feel it looking at me. This wasn't like spotting a deer or even a bear. There was an intelligence behind that gaze that made my blood run cold. This thing was assessing me. Then it moved. Holy shit, the speed. You'd think something that big would be slow or clumsy, but it wasn't. It reached down and grabbed what looked like a fallen tree branch, except this branch was a whole damn tree trunk, maybe 15 feet long and 2 or 3 inches thick. It grabbed this thing with one hand and just lifted it, effortlessly, like I'd pick up a broom. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place, like in those nightmares where your legs won't work. The thing drew back its arm and hurled that tree trunk right at me. Not tossed, hurled, like a fucking javelin. The trunk flew past me, missing by maybe 3 feet, and crashed into the trees behind me. That was enough to break my paralysis. I dropped everything, my camera, my bag, all of it, and ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just ran like a werewolf was after me. I don't remember much about that run back to my car. I know I tore through briars and brush that shredded my arms and face. I know I fell at least twice, getting back up in a blind panic each time. Looking back, it's amazing I didn't break an ankle or worse. All I remember is the pure animal terror pushing me forward. When I finally broke through to the road where my car was parked, I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. As I peeled out of there, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing burst out of the tree line behind me. I drove straight home. No stops, no calls, nothing. Just white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole way. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, drew all the blinds, and sat in my living room with all the lights on until dawn. I must have looked like a complete lunatic. The worst part, I had nothing to show for it. No pictures, no evidence, nothing. Despite being a professional photographer who was literally there to take pictures of wildlife, I didn't get a single shot of the thing. In that moment, all my years of training just evaporated. Self-preservation overrode everything else. Over the next few days, I debated whether to report what I'd seen, but what was I going to say? Hey, Bigfoot tried to kill me with a tree? Without evidence, I'd sound like a nutcase or attention seeker. And honestly, part of me didn't want to acknowledge what happened. Like maybe if I didn't talk about it, it would somehow become less real. I ended up calling the magazine and making up some story about getting sick and not getting the shots they needed. They weren't happy, but they understood. I couldn't bring myself to go back for the equipment I'd left behind. Just wrote it off as a loss. For months afterward, I couldn't sleep without having nightmares about being chased through endless woods. I still can't go hiking or camping without feeling on edge. I've never taken another assignment in Sam Houston National Forest, even though it cost me some decent paydays. I've seen bears, mountain lions, and all kinds of wildlife in my career. I know what they look like, how they move, how they behave. What I saw that day wasn't any known animal. The intelligence behind those eyes, the deliberate way it tried to hurt me, that wasn't animal behavior, yet it wasn't human either. The thing that still haunts me most isn't the creature itself, but the feeling I had in those few seconds when we locked eyes. It wasn't just looking at me, it was challenging me. This was its territory, and I was an intruder. And it had the power, the will, and the intelligence to remove me permanently. I've never told this story publicly before. My wife knows a sanitized version, and a couple of close friends know I had a scary experience in the woods once, but that's it. Who'd believe the full truth? Until you've been in that situation, feeling the primal terror of being prey to something bigger, stronger, and smarter than you expected, you can't understand. I still work as a photographer, but I stick to more populated areas now. Sometimes, when I'm editing photos late at night, I'll catch myself listening for that silence again. That unnatural quiet that falls when something big is nearby. And I wonder if it's still out there, in those woods, waiting for the next person who wanders too far from the trail. I don't have any explanation for what I encountered. All I know is that I was lucky to get away, and I'm never going back to find out more. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 15. I've kept this story to myself for a long time. It's been over 50 years now. But I still remember that day like it was yesterday. November 20th, 1968. The date is burned into my memory. I was 34 then, had my farm near Fort Kells, and considered myself a damn good hunter who'd spent most of my life in the woods around Prince George. I thought I knew every track, every sign that an animal could leave behind. I was wrong. That morning started like any other hunting day. Cold as hell, the kind of British Columbia cold that seeps into your bones. I picked up Jim, my hunting buddy, around 5 a.m. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, heading out to Sugar Bowl Mountain, about 40 miles east of Prince George. The snow had fallen fresh 2 days before, perfect for tracking. Jim and I had this routine. We'd drive out in my old pickup, thermos of coffee between us, rifles in their cases in the back. We barely talked on the drive, just comfortable silence broken by occasional comments about the weather or what we might find. Jim was puffing away on his cigarettes like he always did, and I remember telling him they'd kill him someday. Funny the details, you remember. We took the Boran Forest Service Road, which wasn't much more than a glorified logging path in those days. My truck bounced and rattled over every bump, but I knew that road like the back of my hand. We'd gone about 25 miles in when I decided to pull over at this spot I knew, a clearing where we could park and hike in from there. The air was crisp, probably around 25 degrees. Our breath hung in clouds around us as we got our gear together. I remember checking my rifle, a 30-06 I'd had for years, making sure everything was in order. We each had our day packs, some jerky, more coffee, extra ammunition, the usual. We'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours, following some old deer trails, when we came across something that made us stop dead in our tracks. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There in the snow was a footprint, but not like any I'd ever seen before. It wasn't an elk, wasn't a moose, definitely wasn't a bear. "What the hell is that, Horace?" Jim asked, crouching down next to it. I just shook my head. I couldn't find the words. The print was huge. I'd estimate about 16 inches long. It had clear toe impressions, 5 of them. It looked human, but not human. Too big. Way too big. "Maybe it's some kind of joke?" Jim suggested, but his voice had that edge to it. He knew, same as I did, that we were miles from anywhere. Who would come all the way out here to fake footprints? I knelt down to examine it more closely. The impression was deep. Whatever made it was heavy, and there was a clear arch to it, like a human foot. The snow around the edges was compressed, but not disturbed like you'd see if someone had used a fake foot or something to make the impression. "Let's follow them," I said, standing up. As we tracked, I started counting. The stride between each print was enormous, easily 6 feet. Each step clearly showed alternating right and left feet. No animal I knew walked like that. I've tracked bears all my life. Black bears, grizzlies. I know their prints. Bears don't leave tracks like these. When a bear walks, its hind foot often partially overlaps the print from its front foot. These tracks showed no overlap. Each one was distinct, purposeful. We followed those tracks for about a half mile. I counted around 50 prints in total. They seemed to be about a day old. The edges had that slight crystallization you get when snow has been exposed to air for hours. No bear alive could have made these tracks, I told Jim, who just nodded silently, his face pale. The tracks led us toward a denser part of the forest. They were so regular, so deliberate. Whatever made them was walking, not running, not panicked, just walking through the forest like it owned the place. Then we came to a fallen log, a big old cedar that had probably come down in the last storm. The tracks led right up to it, and then nothing. On the other side, there was untouched snow, no prints at all. "It jumped," Jim suggested, looking at the log, which was about 4 feet high. "And landed without leaving any marks?" I replied. We circled the area, looking for where the tracks might have continued. Nothing. It was like whatever made those prints had just vanished into thin air. That's when we noticed something else strange. Near where we'd first found the tracks, there were tire marks on the road. Someone had pulled over, and there were human footprints, normal-sized ones, leading from the road to the tracks and then back again. Someone else had found these before us. "Let's get pictures," I said. I'd brought my camera that day, thankfully, a Kodak I'd had for years. I took about a dozen photos, being careful to include my hunting knife in some of them for scale. We spent another hour or so looking around the area. I don't know what we expected to find. More tracks, the thing itself. But there was nothing, just those 50-some prints, and then nothing. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we were spooked. It was barely noon, but we decided to head back. The hunting trip was forgotten. All I could think about were those tracks. On the drive back, Jim and I tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Could be a hoax, Jim said for the 10th time. Who'd go all that way into the woods to play a prank that hardly anyone would see? I countered. Maybe it was a deformed bear, he suggested. Something with a genetic mutation. I shook my head. Bears don't walk like that. Those were right-left tracks, Jim. Clear as day. And no drag marks, no sign of a loping gait. Whatever made those was walking upright on 2 legs. We fell into silence after that. What else was there to say? I didn't report what we found right away. I wanted proof first. I got the film developed a week later. The prints were there in black and white, unmistakable, unexplainable. That's when I finally went to the local wildlife office. I showed the photos to Bill Freeman, the regional biologist. I expected him to be as shocked as I was. Instead, he barely glanced at them before suggesting they might have been made by a wolverine. A wolverine? I nearly lost my temper. Bill, I've been hunting these woods for 30 years. I know wolverine tracks. These were bipedal tracks with a 6-foot stride. No wolverine alive walks on 2 legs with a stride that big. He just shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. Sometimes when wolverines lope through deep snow, their tracks can look unusual. I knew it was bullshit. Those tracks showed clear right and left feet. A loping wolverine would have had 4 prints in a group, not alternating single prints. But I could see he wasn't going to budge. When I got home, I laid all the photos out on my kitchen table. Looking at them again, I felt the same chill I'd felt in the forest. Those weren't animal tracks, at least not any animal I recognized. But they weren't human either. Too big, too spread out. The next weekend, Jim and I went back to the spot. The snow had melted some, and then a fresh dusting had fallen. Any trace of the tracks was long gone. We searched the area for hours, but found nothing. Over the next few months, I asked around. Had anyone else seen strange tracks? Had anyone reported anything unusual? Most people just gave me odd looks. A few humored me, but I could tell they thought I was either lying or had been mistaken. But there was this one old-timer at the feed store who pulled me aside after overhearing me ask the clerk about it. "I believe you," he said quietly. My father saw something similar back in 32. Up near Eliza Lake, huge tracks in the snow, 6-foot stride. Nobody believed him either. That was the only confirmation I ever got. I still have those photographs, tucked away in an old shoebox. The corners are yellowed now, the images fading, but you can still make out those enormous prints in the snow. I've thought about that day thousands of times over the years. I've considered every explanation. A hoax. Possible, but unlikely given the remote location and the perfect detail in the prints. A known animal? Absolutely not. I've spent my life in those woods. I know every track a local animal can make. So what does that leave? I'm not saying they were Sasquatch tracks. I'm not putting a name to it. All I know is what I saw, what Jim and I both saw. Tracks that shouldn't exist, made by something I can't explain. Jim passed away in '94. Lung cancer, just like I warned him about. Before he died, we talked about that day one last time. "We should have followed them further," he said. "Should have seen where they went. Sometimes I dream about those tracks. In my dreams, I follow them past that fallen log into the thick bush, and I find... But that's just it. I always wake up before I see what made them. I'm an old man now. I've had a good life, raised a family, worked my land. I'm not given to flights of fancy or tall tales. I know what I saw that day in November 1968. 16-inch footprints with a 6-foot stride walking through the snowy wilderness of British Columbia. I'm not asking you to believe me. Hell, most people don't. But if you're ever out in those woods, keep your eyes open. And if you find tracks in the snow that don't make sense, that can't be explained by anything you know. Well, then you'll understand why I'm still thinking about what Jim and I found all those years ago. I still don't have answers. Just questions. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still ask myself, what were they?